Greetings, church. Wanting to right above there is the cross. No, sorry. That's the bottom of the cross right there, and behind me is the board of repentance. But today I want to go ahead and open up in the word of prayer, and we also want to do some communion with the Lord when we do the supper. Notice my little sign here, Church of Portland. This is the sign that I use every week when I do the church, and this is also the sign that I use when I do Bible study. Turn it around. Ta-da! Pretty clever, huh? That's the Bible study sign, and that's the church sign. So I wanted to introduce the sign to you. Sign of the time. And what I'd like to do today is basically, and on the left over there, you will see the city of Portland. I don't think you can see it because it's too bright, but we're going to keep the camera focused this way, and so we can do the ministry, or else there'll be a glare back there. And we want to take a minute and to pray, and then we're going to jump right into doing this ministry today. Hopefully the sound will work, and we'll be able to get through. It is almost 3:30 in the afternoon on the 25th of February, and we have a lot of scripture to cover. We are in Mark chapter 14, verses 1 through 72. So we have quite a bit of work that we need to get done today, and we're going to try to do it as quickly as we can, but with the thought in mind that we cover everything that God wants us to cover. All right? So let me go ahead and open up in the word of prayer. Father, I thank you for this afternoon, and thank you, Lord, for an opportunity to preach your word in season and out of season. Thank you for the opportunity to bring me back here. Last time I preached was outside. May you be with me this hour. May you open up the minds of those who are listening, or those that are going to be watching this video, to understand exactly what you are communicating to us in every generation from the first century since this incident has occurred. May you be with me. May you be with the church, wherever the church is at today, whether they be at work, at home, doing the ministry, on the mission field, some are in seminary, wherever they are. May you be with each one of us, Lord God. And I just got done watching the Billy Graham, one of Billy Graham's specials, and I was encouraged by that, to see that ministry, Lord God, still flourishing. Billy today is 96 or 97 years old, and that was him on the television in his 50s. May you continue, Lord God, to bless him and his family. May you continue to bless me and mine, and may you be with my words. In Jesus' name, amen. So, church, I want to go ahead and summarize chapters 1 through 13 of Mark chapter 14 of Mark. Mark is the gospel that we've been looking at since last year sometime, and this is our 14th chapter. But in chapter 1 through 13, Mark basically introduces Israel to the Christ, right? He introduces, this is the shortest of the four Gospels, and he introduces Israel to the Christ, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Mary and the son of Joseph. Remember, Joseph was a carpenter. Mark basically leaves out the birth of Christ in his gospel, and begins his gospel with John the Baptist, the relative of Christ. Basically, he's a forerunner, and basically his ministry in life was to prepare Israel for the coming of Messiah. He established water baptism, while Christ himself established the baptism of the Holy Spirit. Jesus, what he does is he reopens the door of communication after about 400 years of silence between God and man. Of course, throughout that time, Israel was praying to God and God was answering prayers, but direct communication had stopped for a period of time. So through Christ, the Old Testament atonement we see in Mark was established or was abolished, and a new covenant was established, which is what we're going to be talking about today. This new covenant was not in the blood of bulls and goats, but as we will see in chapter 14, it will be in his own blood. Most likely chapter 15, because he makes mention of it in 14, but it's really 15, and then 16 ends the whole thing, his life and ministry. So the blood of the Lamb who takes away the sins of the world, coming from the Gospel of John. His ministry for 3.5 years basically was to preach himself as the good news. In other words, he had to give them the message about who he was. And he was the good news, the way to salvation. To cure the sick, to raise the dead, and establish a new leadership under a new covenant, through those who believed in his name. He couldn't have done it without them believing. That's who he was. So this group he calls the church. Those who believed in his name, he called the church. So now we see in chapter 14, we will see his Last Supper. We're going to see the betrayal, the new covenant being established, the fact that he's going to be arrested, tried before Jewish leaders, and he's even going to be denied by his apostles. But before we do, keep in mind that our last chapter that we looked at was in Mark chapter 13, verses 1 through 37, and the title was basically the sign of his second coming. The other day I was reading the book of Ephesians, and I was looking at the armor there in Ephesians, and I think when you look at Ephesians 6, and you look at the armor, and you look at the Gospel of Mark, the two don't go together, right? It doesn't look like it goes together. Not until, if you look at Mark chapter 13, not until you get to that one part in Mark 13:37 where it says, be on the alert, right? Remember the whole chapter, Mark 13, 1 through 2, Jesus prophesied the destruction of the stone buildings. They were coming out of the temple. And in Mark 13, 3 through 8, Jesus explains birth pangs to prepare the people for the time of the end, right? And Mark 13, 9 through 13, salvation will only come to those who endure suffering, right? The flogging, the mistreatment, the arrest, the betrayals, and the hatred, all of that he talked about. And in Mark 13, 14 through 23, Jesus talks about the days of the abomination of desolation will be filled. It'll be filled with suffering, tribulation, fear, misleading, deception by false Christs against the elect. So Jesus basically prepared the disciples for the coming of the end. We see in Mark 13, 24 through 27, after the tribulation will come the second coming of Christ, and then the rapture of the church, right? And then we see in Mark 13, 28 through 32, Jesus telling the disciples to recognize the sign of his second coming. There are specific things to look forward to, so they need to be aware of that. And then in verses Mark 13, 33 through 37, Jesus warned his disciples to be on the alert for his return. Right? Be on the alert for his return. Now, if you keep your fingers in Mark 13, 14, and you go to Ephesians chapter 6, this is fascinating because where Jesus leaves off, Paul picks up. Now, what Paul does is, I think what Paul is trying to say here is, as we prepare for the second coming of Christ, as we prepare for the second coming of Christ, we need to be able to stand strong in the Lord. And we need to wear the armor of God, right? How strong do we need to be? As strong as Jesus is going to show us that he is, right? When we read Mark chapter 14. Because it takes a strong man to literally humble himself and turn himself over to a group of 500-600 people that he knows hates him and that's going to crucify and murder him, right? How terrible is that? And yet Paul basically says this is how strong we need to be. We need to be so strong that we literally have to take what God has given to us as if it were an armor, comparing the armor of God with comparing what God has given to us in Christianity with the armor that the empire the armor that the empire has worn. I think I have a picture here somewhere. I'll show you. Here, this was to remind me. I got this out of a book. This is the Roman's armor. You see there. There is the helmet of salvation on the guy that's behind him. We have the breastplate of righteousness, right there. The breastplate of righteousness, the sword of the Spirit, right? The word of God, which is the spear, not the spear, but the sword. And I don't know if you can see it. At the bottom there is the shield of faith, and then it says here in verse 15, right? The feet with the gospel of peace, and the loins with truth. That basically covers the armor. But I think the whole, and I'm going to put that right here underneath the sign. You probably won't see it. Right? I'll lift it up. It's right here. And actually, let's put it under the cross. Can we put it under the cross? Yeah, put it under the cross. Because I think it might be more visible. The armor there, I think Paul basically what he does is he picks up from where Christ leaves off. And what he does here is he gives us the full armor, and at the end of chapter 6, he says this in verse 18, right? He says, with all prayer and petition, pray at all times in the Spirit, and with this in view, be on the alert with all perseverance and petition for all the saints. Now, what he does here in chapter 6 is he prepares the church at Ephesus, and he tells them that there's coming, our struggle as Christians is not against flesh and blood, right? But it's against the devil and all of the angels and the powers and principalities and spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places. And he says that this is the armor that God has given to us. And he's comparing the biblical spiritual armor that we have in Scripture with the Roman armor. So he's using that right there so that we have and he's talking to probably some Roman Christians, so to help them understand what this is all about, right? So take and he's probably talking to Christians that came out of the empire, right? So, and this is and so what I want to point out here, I don't want to go through this is for another time, but what I want to, we need to get back to the Lord. But what I want to point out here is what he says in verse 18 is, be on the alert with all perseverance and petition for all the saints. You see, the same warning that Jesus gave to his disciples is the same warning that Paul gives to the church at Ephesus. The alertness and the warning is to be ready for whatever the devil has in store. Be ready for whatever Satan has. He's always throwing darts at us. He's always throwing darts. When I first moved into this apartment complex, the studio here, when you go through the leasing, it says in little black letters that there might be a time when they increase your rent. And of course, I've been here for almost 10 months, going almost on a year. And the other day, I opened up my door, and outside of it is this envelope with my name on it. And I thought, oh, okay, well, management must have something for me to read. So I read it, and there it is, rent increase in big bold letters. And I thought to myself, oh God, the last thing I need. I just lost my job. And I couldn't retrieve it. And I thought, that is the last thing I want to read, is the management, telling me that I have to do what? I have to give them more money for the studio. And here I've been looking for a 1-bedroom all this time and haven't been able to find one. All the places that I've looked are pretty much booked up. And you have to put your name on a list. But, I was not ready for that. But God says, be on the alert, and be ready. So, the connection here is that I think for the sign of his second coming and for all that we're going to suffer, we have to have an armor strong enough, a spiritual armor strong enough to be able to endure anything that the devil wants to throw at us or wants to use to cause us to stumble. What used to be a stumbling block now becomes like drinking water. Right? It becomes like drinking water. Why? Because it cannot penetrate and enter into our hearts. It has to bounce off. It's like bullets. So it's like bulletproof vest. Our souls, our spirit, our character as men must be like, it's like when it hits you. And let me tell you something. It's going to hit hard when the devil comes out, because the warning here is the schemes of the devil, the plans, the evil plans of the devil. The devil is always scheming, always lying, always manipulating, always doing something to distract the Christian and put him in a position where he's off the grid, off of God. Sort of like if you're running a marathon, right? The other day I went to 24 hours and I ran 13.5 miles. I was there for like 4 hours running and I was exhausted. My legs were in so much pain at the end of that. And, as you're running, there's a lot of distractions. People are all over the place trying to get your attention. And they don't mean to do it, but you're distracted naturally, right? And what Paul does here and what Christ does is Christ prepares them and says, you need to be on the alert for this coming time, Christians. Not just the disciples, but for all the disciples that are coming, right? You need to be on the alert. You need to be prepared for this change that's coming. And then Paul picks that up and he says, you know what? You need to actually wear this armor. You're going to need this armor. Again, the same encouragement. So now Christ using the mouth of Paul and literally saying, this is what you're going to need. You're going to need this armor right here, right? To prepare yourself for these events that are coming, for these things that are about to happen, for these struggles that you're going to have against the devil. Because it's the devil, right, that stands inside of the man of lawlessness in the temple that creates the abomination of desolation. So now Jesus, I just wanted to make mention of that. But going back to Mark chapter 14, and I hope I didn't throw you off. But I want to read Mark 14, leaving off where Christ, catching up where Christ had left off. Now in Mark 14, Jesus' new covenant and betrayal is introduced to us by Mark. And Mark says, now here's what happened after he prepared the disciples for his second coming and for all the destruction that is to come. Now be on the alert. Keep in mind you're going to need an armor for you to basically withstand what the devil's about to do here, okay, in the future. And it's not just a one-time thing. It's throughout, the next 2,000 years until he actually returns. I don't know, maybe he'll return after 3,000 years. But in any case, let's read Mark 14. It's a very long chapter. And what we're going to do is we're going to take it. Normally what I would do is I would read the whole chapter and then go back and look at each individual portions on how the scholars have broken down the scripture. But for time's sake, I think it's probably safer to just sort of like read it and then talk about it, right? Read it and then talk about it. It might save us some time and just get to the point. I don't know. Maybe this is the whole crucifixion thing here that we're about to read about, the betrayal. Maybe this is a test of the faith of the Jews. Maybe this is a test of the faith of Israel to see whether or not the Jews really were expecting a Messiah, and if they were, in what format or context would they have expected him to come, right? Because when they asked him, in when they took him to Caiaphas, and he stood before Caiaphas, and Caiaphas asked him, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One?" Jesus says, "Yes, I am." Right? So maybe this is a test to see whether or not they even believe what the prophets had prophesied was coming. Right? So the first portion of scripture we want to read is Mark 14, verses 1 through 2, which is basically Jewish leaders plotted Jesus' assassination. Right? Mark 14, 1 through 2. Jewish leaders plotted Jesus' assassination. It says here that now the feast of the Passover and unleavened bread was 2 days off, and the chief priests and the scribes were seeking how to seize him by stealth and kill him. For they were saying, "Not during the festival, lest there be a riot of the people." Right? So 2 days before the traditional festival of Passover and unleavened bread, there was a plot brewing against Jesus. And of course, Jesus knew this was happening. Right? It's not like he was blinded. Throughout the book of Mark, we saw, Christ several times prepared the disciples and told them this is what was coming, this is what was coming, this is what was coming. Right? The chief priests, of the Aaronic priesthood, and the scholars or the scribes, they wanted this non-educated, non-positioned son of a carpenter, right, murdered for his insult, right, to those recognized would-be Jewish leaders, those who have been established. I mean, you have to understand the mentality of these people here. These people are from Aaron's priesthood. They have a history. They have a legacy. They have a tenure. They have been part of Jewish history, right? So they're stationed. And these scholars, these scribes, men who spend day and night studying the law of Moses, the 613 laws of Moses. And here comes this carpenter's son who spends all day building boxes and furniture and houses and whatnot. And here he comes with this claim to being Messiah. So they were insulted. And they wanted to do away with him because they felt that their position was threatened by all of his miracles and the things that he was doing, right? So they wanted to take him away quietly as possible, not to inflame his followers, right? These Jewish leaders feared the response of the people. Why? Because the response of the people might have led them to what? To rebellion against Rome and against the foreigners. I mean, there was already tension brewing between Rome and the Jews, right? There was tension there. This was their country, and Rome, a Gentile nation coming in, basically took over, right? And of course, there are other foreigners in that region. We read about that in Acts chapter 2, after the Holy Spirit had come down, and the disciples started talking in different languages. So that was to mark that there are different other nations there in the area. So they didn't want his death to be to cause a riot, right? In fear of their own death, right? By the hands of the people who believed in him, right? It's like his believers versus the ones who didn't believe in him but stood with them as Jewish leaders. So if we were to summarize or conclude these 2 points, right? Behind his back, Jesus was wanted as a dead man. He was wanted as a dead man by those who were leading Israel at the time, by the rulers of his people, right? We can read about this in Matthew 26, verses 1 through 5, right? You go one book over, the Gospel of Matthew, which is probably the longest one, Matthew 26, 1 through 5. And it says that verse 3, verse 3 says, "You know that after 2 days the Passover is coming, and the Son of Man is to be delivered up for crucifixion. Then the chief priests and the elders of the people were gathered together in the court of the high priest named Caiaphas, and they plotted together to seize Jesus by stealth and kill him. Right? But they were saying, not during the festival, lest a riot occur among the people. You know, they wanted to kill him, but they also wanted to make sure that no riot broke out. We want to move to Mark 14, 3 through 9, where Jesus anointed for burial with perfume. Right? So meanwhile, in Bethany, now we saw the enemy. Now what Mark does is he tells us about where Jesus is and what Jesus is doing. If the temple had been in Jerusalem, and that's where they were, so Mark basically moves his thinking from Jerusalem now to Bethany, the place where Christ was with his disciples and some other Christians. And he says this, verses 3 through 9. Mark says, "And while he was in Bethany at the home of Simon the leper, and reclining at table, reclining at table, there came a woman with an alabaster vial of costly perfume of pure nard, and she broke the vial and poured it over his head. But some were indignant, remarking to one another, 'For what purpose has this perfume been wasted? For this perfume might have been sold for over 300 denarii, and the money given to the poor.' And they were scolding her. But Jesus said, 'Let her alone. Why do you bother her? She has done a good deed to me. For the poor you always have with you, and whenever you wish, you can do them good. But you do not always have me. But she has done what she could. She has anointed my body beforehand for the burial. And truly I say to you, wherever the gospel is preached in the whole world, that also which this woman has done shall be spoken of in memory of her.'" Now, I guess there's something I should probably say right off the bat. If you go to John chapter 12, verses 1 through 8, John 12, 1 through 8, here's a similar story. And in this similar story, again, it's an anointing at Bethany, but it's not the same day, and it's not the same time, and it's not the same group. Listen to this. It says, "Jesus therefore 6 days before the Passover came to Bethany, where Lazarus was, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. So they made him a supper there, and Martha was serving, but Lazarus was one of those reclining at the table with him. Mary therefore took a pound of very costly, genuine spikenard ointment, and anointed the feet of Jesus, and wiped his feet with her hair. And the house was filled with the fragrance of the anointed. But Judas Iscariot, one of his disciples, who was intending to betray him, said, 'Why was this ointment not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor?' Now he said this not because he was concerned about the poor, but because he was a thief, and as he had the money box, he used to pilfer what was put into it. Jesus therefore said, 'Let her alone, in order that she may keep it for the day of my burial. For the poor you always have with you, but you do not always have me.'" So here's the same story of Jesus being anointed, but that was done 6 days before the crucifixion, and the one that we're reading about that Mark records is 2 days before. And it's the same story of his head being anointed in Mark's gospel, his feet being anointed in John's gospel, and the response of Judas probably in both gospels is the same. Why wasn't this money sold? Why wasn't this ointment sold, perfume sold for 300 denarii? He would have gotten 600 out of it. But that the Lord had orchestrated it so that it was to anoint his body, prepare his body for his upcoming burial. So we see that in verse 3, Jesus, coming back now to Mark's gospel, 2 days before, right? Jesus visited Simon, a leper, right, who had leprosy. Remember, Moses had leprosy. He had a leper's hand in the Old Testament, and God wanted Moses to represent him, and told him to put his hands in the jacket, and the hand was leprous, right? And then he pulled it back. So it's sort of a disease, a sickness, where you can't even associate with anyone. We also know that the sister of Moses had gotten leprosy for mouthing off to the Lord and making some foul statements. But here, Jesus visited Simon, a leper, and probably a former leper, because if Jesus was there, he probably was cured, right? And they probably were having a meal with Jesus after curing him of his disease. And this woman was there, and she poured perfume on his head. Now, why would she pour perfume on his head without her even understanding? Maybe she wanted to just bless him, right? When you look at Mark's gospel, Mark doesn't exactly explain in verse 3 why she did it, but he took it as preparation for his burial, right? She didn't explain why she did it. She did it out of love, perhaps, right? Because she felt that was something that was probably the most generous, caring thing she could have probably done for Jesus, right, at the time. I mean, there was nothing to explain it. Why do you take someone and wash their feet, to cleanse them? Why do you cure someone? To remove away the disease. So then why would you pour that kind of perfume, to make them smell good, to purify him, cleanse him? Verse 4 says, but some were indignant, remarking to one another, for what purpose has this perfume been wasted? Obviously, their mentality was not the same as that of the woman's mentality or Christ's mentality, right? Because the disciples didn't agree with the woman's actions, considering it a waste, especially, probably Judas, whose mindset was not on purifying or cleansing Christ, but was always about the money. We see in verse 5, it says, for this perfume might have been sold for over 300 denarii, and the money given to the poor, and they were scolding her. Right, so there was probably more than one disciple. We know that in John's gospel that it says that it was Judas, but here the word is they, which is plural. That means there's probably more than one disciple who was in agreement with Judas and saying, hey, they probably chimed along and says, you know what, Judas is right, Lord. That's a lot of money to be, I agree with this guy, because, maybe the perfume could have been sold and didn't have to be wasted. So some disciples didn't agree with the woman's actions, considering it a waste. And in verse 5, they felt the perfume could have been sold and money for the poor, 300 denarii, and she was scolded for it. I don't know how you feel about it, right? Jesus was not one to perfume himself. In his 3.5 years, he was never one to quaff and wear these new outfits and present himself as if he was some Roman emperor. He never presented himself that way. No crowns and nothing to catch the eye or the attention of man. Right? When you read in Isaiah says, when you go to Isaiah 53 says this, is that he had no stately beauty. Most people who wear perfume and present themselves that way is usually the people that are in high and mighty, the rich. If you remember in let's see here, the adornment of themselves. Go to Isaiah 53. Scripture says that he was a man of sorrow, acquainted with grief. He was despised and forsaken. When you look at verse 2, it says, and like a root out of parched ground, he has no stately form or majesty, that we should look upon him, nor appearance that we should be attracted to him. You see, Jesus never presented himself in such a way that people would be drawn to his physical appearance. And a lot of times, the kings of the earth presented themselves in long robes and crowns and beautiful vestment, so that people who were on that level would be attracted to him, to his money, to his wealth, to his beauty, to his scent. And that's where it is in that context that perfume is usually used, right? Or the women who adorn themselves. And so Christ never presented himself that way to the people as he did ministry for them. The disciples weren't used to that. They were always, that's why they made the issue the poor, right? That it's like, what are you doing? Are you switching sides now or what? I mean, it's like, we've got the poor here who needs the money. What are you doing going out and buying yourself a brand new suit, Lord? About the, right? And so, sort of like that kind of mentality. It's like, what? She's making you smell good? What about the? It's like, I thought our ministry and our whole life was about, pouring it out on a giving to the poverty and to the sick. Now it's like, what are you doing here? Yeah, and so it kind of annoyed them, per se. So Jesus, in verse 6, he rebuked the disciples for her good deed, right? In verse 6, he rebukes them. He says, let her alone. Why do you bother her? She has done me, or she has done a good deed to me. If that was the only thing that she could do prior to his death, and she was there listening and knowing what was going to happen, right? If that was the only thing that she could do, she did it. Hands down, it doesn't matter, man. He's going to die, and I want him clean, right? So if that was the only thing that she could give back in return, she did it. So, but he rebuked them, right? He's saying, hey, somebody wants to bless me. There's nothing wrong with somebody giving back to me, right? And in verse 7, he says, for the poor you always have with you, and whenever you wish, you can do to them, right? And whenever you wish, you can do to them good, but you do not always have me, right? So Jesus reminds them that they will not always have him, but the poor will always be there for them to, for good to be done to them, right? Jesus is reminding them of the short time that they have together. If there's something that you want to do, in return, now's the time, right? Because you don't know, you're not going to have it forever. I mean, this is it, boys. This is our last time together. This is the big finale. This is the grand poupée, right? Or the pas de deux of the nutcracker here. So this is it. It's like, that's why he says, you're not going to always have me. I'm only here for a little while, and then, like the clouds of heaven, I'm gone. And in verse 8, he backs her up and he steps it up and he says, she has done what she could. She has anointed my body beforehand for the burial, right? She prepared him for burial. It's a symbolic, he took it as a symbol of what was coming in his own life, right? Not literal, at least not yet, but for what was to come. The world, he says in verse 9, will remember what she did when the gospel is preached, right? And then he backs it up with saying this, and truly I say to you, wherever the gospel is preached in the whole world, that also which this woman has done shall be spoken of in memory of her. So he includes her as part and as being part of his gospel, because she was probably one of the only people who shown him any kind of kindness before he came face to face with his betrayer and the trial. The only, the only act of kindness that could have been shown to him at that hour, 2 days before the Passover. So if we were to summarize and conclude these verses from 3 to 9, we see that Jesus received this act of kindness, right? As if he had already been dead, right? In preparation for his burial. To Jesus, he had already died. Looking ahead to Christ, the deed had already been done, right? It had already been done. To him, it was over already. It had been done, and now this woman was preparing his body, his dead body, for burial. It's almost like it's already been done. That was the mindset of Christ toward her. And he says, this act of kindness that's being done to me by this woman will always be spoken of when the gospel is preached in memory of her. He didn't even give her name. Right? We know that in John, when Jesus was at the house of Lazarus, there was Mary and Martha, and I think it was Mary who pointed the ointment over his feet and washed it with her hair. But in this segment here, we don't know her name. So we're going to move on to verse 10 through 11, where Judas sought to betray Jesus for money. Verse 10 says, and Judas Iscariot, not Jesus Iscariot, but Judas Iscariot, Mark continues to explain what has happened. And Judas Iscariot, who was one of the 12, went off to the chief priests in order to betray him to them. And they were glad when they heard this and promised to give him money. And he began seeking how to betray him at an opportune time. How unfortunate. Judas switched sides. When we looked at verse 10, 3.5 years of ministry, and at the last hour, Judas switched his sides. The miracles, the feeding of the thousands, the walking on water, he was in the boat. Right? When they went to the wedding at Cana, he saw the wine. I mean, all of the miraculous thing that Jesus had done, Judas was there to witness. Right? Judas switched sides and went to Caiaphas. And I think it probably angered Judas that the money, the whole money issue. And I think I make mention of it later on, if I can remember my notes here, that Judas basically switched side because of the fact that twice money wasn't part of Jesus' ministry, or money was not gained, and he somehow wanted the 300 twice. We see it 6 days before and then 2 days before. And then finally he couldn't hold it in, and so he went in and he betrayed Christ for 30. He settled for 30 pieces of silver. But he couldn't get the denarii for the perfume, so he betrayed Christ himself in his anger. But I don't know, it's just an observation. So Judas switched sides and went to Caiaphas to betray Jesus, right? Judas didn't like Jesus' response to his protest of wasted perfume and lost money, right? So he figured out another way to make money. 30 pieces of silver instead of $300 denarii, or better yet, $600 denarii, right? If he had sold the perfume twice. And then in verse 11, we see that Caiaphas and the other Jewish leaders, that is the Pharisees, Sadducees, Zealots, scribes, and the high priest, all agreed to pay him money and plotted when, where, and probably how to apprehend him, right? Because Judas was part of the 12, and so he knows exactly where Jesus would have taken the disciples. So just these two verses, if we were to conclude, right, we see that Judas snitched against Jesus, right? He snitched against Jesus because he had to snitch. He had to tell them where he was going to be at, right? So Judas snitched against Jesus and probably repeated what he said about his death to affirm to the Jewish leaders that this was his time to die, right? So Judas probably went over there and opened this trap and told the Jewish leaders exactly what Jesus had been saying, that he was going to be crucified and he was going to be murdered and he was going to be... And so they figured, oh, okay, well then, if that's how it's supposed to happen, then we'll help you, right? So they got the assurance that their plan was right, to basically seize and kill Jesus and to move forward with it. Once Judas came and told them what he was foretelling, they were like, that's exactly what we wanted to do to him, right? So Judas's actions basically helped him confirm their plans. Satan moved into action right on time. Right? Satan and Judas moved into action and used the hands of the Sanhedrin and the chief priests and the Romans to carry out what he was trying to carry out 33.5 years before, when Herod was king. And he had set the empire guards and to kill the babies. So now here it was, right in the palm of his hands. So while Jesus was looking only to fulfill the words of Isaiah, right, in Isaiah 53, 1 through 12, two different motives, we see that two different motives basically was leading to his death, right? One was to end the Old Testament atonement and begin a new covenant, and two, to destroy the enemy of the Jewish leaders, because he wasn't on their level. Don't get confused with what I'm saying here. One was to end Old Testament atonement. When Christ went to the cross, it was to end Old Testament atonement of sacrificing bulls and goats, right? Their blood. And number two, we see that the destruction of the enemy of the Jewish leaders, which is Christ. Christ was the enemy that needed to be destroyed. God was trying to end an Old Testament atonement practice, but the Jews were trying to kill their enemy, who was leading them away from what they considered to be God's law and God's will. So they were looking at it from two different points of view, from two different sides of the cross. God was trying to do one thing, and they were trying to do another. All right? And they didn't see Christ on their level, because he was hated by them. So Judas snitched and went behind Christ's back and basically turned him over. So we want to move on from there, and I hope I didn't confuse anyone. We see Mark 14, verses 12 through 16. Jesus sends his disciples to find a place to prepare and eat Passover, right? And eat Passover. I want to turn to Leviticus 23 here. Leviticus 23, verses 4 through 8. 4 through 8 says, "These are the appointed times of the Lord, holy convocations, which you shall proclaim at the times appointed for them." This is basically talking about the festival of unleavened bread and the Passover itself, right? In the first month, on the 14th day of the month at twilight, is the Lord's Passover. Then on the 15th day of the same month, there is the feast of unleavened bread to the Lord. For 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall have a holy convocation. You shall not do any laborious work. But for 7 days you shall present an offering by fire to the Lord. On the 7th day is a holy convocation. You shall not do any laborious work. So it is from this time and era that the whole festival of unleavened bread and the Passover began, because the Jews had just been removed out of Egypt. And you know, the Passover is when the Jews had to kill an animal and take the blood of the animal and put it on the doorpost, so that when the spirit of death would pass, the spirit of death would see the blood and pass over that household, knowing that that was a Jewish household, and would not strike the firstborn of that household. That was the Passover. And out of it, the Jews were in such a hurry to kill the animal and prepare the meal that they didn't even allow the bread to rise, and it became unleavened bread, right? So they took it as unleavened bread. That was what the scholars, that's what I had read. I was like, oh, I didn't know that. But that's basically what they had written down. So going back now to Mark, it's around this time when Jesus establishes the new covenant and is betrayed. And so we see in chapter 14, verse 12, Scripture says this: "And on the first day of the feast of unleavened bread," now remember there's 7 days, as we just read in Leviticus, "when the Passover lamb was being sacrificed, the animal had to be killed, the blood had to be spilled, and then they would degut it, clean it, and and they would put it on the altar to be burned. His disciples said to him, "Where do you want us to go and prepare for you to eat the Passover?" And he sent 2 of his disciples and said to them, "Go into the city, and a man will meet you carrying a pitcher of water. Follow him." Right? Verse 13. And wherever he enters, say to the owner of the house, "The teacher says, where is my guest room, in which I may eat the Passover with my disciples? And he himself will show you a large upper room furnished and ready and prepared for us there." And the disciples went out and came to the city and found it just as he had told them. And they prepared the Passover. Right? So day 1 of the festival, the disciples inquired to Jesus where he wanted to eat and celebrate Passover and feast of unleavened bread. Right? So he tells them from verse 12 through 16, he tells them. Right? He sends them out as his disciples to meet a person that they had never known, never seen before, that would lead them to a place, right, where they can celebrate the feast. Jesus basically told them what to ask when they got to the house. Ask for a guest room, a place to eat, a place to prepare, a place to fellowship, a place to worship, right? Away from the streets of Israel, away from the streets of Jerusalem, not in front of the Roman Empire, not in the synagogues. Remember, Jesus didn't have a place of his own, and the church had not yet established its own place, right? This is just the beginning of it all, so they needed an upper room. Now, we don't know what they did the year before, right? Or the first 2 years before, or the first 3 years before, right? This is the last year. This is the end of it all, right? This is the day before. This is the day that he gets arrested. He takes that hit. So the first 3 Passovers before that, the author of the Gospels don't tell us how they spent it. So the first Passover, we don't know. Second, third. Now we're in the 4th Passover of his, and final Passover of his ministry. And they decide, okay, well, we'll rent out a house. Maybe that was traditionally what they did every year, right? Rent out a room, and they'd go in, and they would celebrate Passover. Maybe that's what they did the year before, and the year before, and the year before, right? Who knows? It doesn't say. Verse 15 says that Jesus says that they will show you a large upper room ready and furnished, and there they will eat the Passover. So the disciples found the man and the room and prepared the Passover meal. So if we were to conclude and summarize verses 12 through 16, we see that Jesus kept the Jewish festivals, right? Even though he was inaugurating or establishing a whole new covenant, we see that he kept the tradition of his people. But he was making a transition here. So he took 3.5 years to transition, right, from one faith to another. So Jesus kept the Jewish festivals and prepared them for the switch from one old covenant to a new covenant. It will no longer be a Passover covenant, but one made in the shedding of his blood, which you can read about in Hebrews, right? In the book of Hebrews, New Testament, book of Hebrews, chapters 9 and 10. So we want to move on to Mark 14, 17 through 21, where Jesus discloses the motive of a disciple to betray him. Now he wants to turn his attention not on the meal, nor on the room, but on what is about to take place to change the course and to make that switch. Right? It is the man of betrayal. The man who the devil has put in the room, has his hands and feet, has his eyes and ears, and has his mouthpiece. Right? Jesus discloses the motive of a disciple, or basically of a devil, right? That was put there by Satan to betray him. So we see in verse 17 through 21, Mark says this, as he continues with the story, he says, "And when it was evening, he came with the 12, and as they were reclining at table and eating, Jesus said, 'Truly I say to you, that one of you will betray me, one who is eating with me.' They began to be grieved and say to him, one by one, 'Surely not I.' And he said to them, 'It is one of the 12, one who dips with me in the bowl, for the Son of Man is to go, just as it is written of him. But woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been good for that man if he had not been born. Those are some strong words coming from the man of Galilee, right? Those are some strong words. And going back to verse 17, he says, in the evening, Jesus and the 12 entered the room, right? So these people knew exactly who he was. The neighbors were probably murmuring about the whole thing, right? And you know, Jesus never went anywhere without having a following behind him. And here's the amazing thing here. When you look at this verse, he says, it is one of the 12. So is it possible that there were others in the room with him? Maybe some women? Maybe some other people? I mean, where did Jesus ever go where there wasn't more than one person? Right? So it's just an observation, because he says here, it is one of the 12. One of the 12. So is there a 13, a 14, a 15, a 30, a 50? I mean, who knows how many others, right? But traditionally, I think most people just stick, they, even in photographs or in pictures, you see that it's Jesus and the 12. You don't see others serving the meal. But there might have been. I would assume there would be. Right? So their first time, so this would have been their first time meeting perhaps in their own place. We don't know, right? It might have been their first time. The first 3 years, they might have just hung out outside and ate outside or visited someone. Maybe they went and ate the Passover with Mary or with one of the disciples' wives, Peter. Right? We don't know. But here, the record states that they had their own place and not the synagogue of the Jews, right, who practiced Judaism. This is where the division of Judaism and Christianity begins, right? Because the Jews didn't do this. Judaism did not eat the bread and the cup as Jesus is about to signify it here in these passages. So we see this is the loss of an old covenant, the loss of the synagogue, a division established between Jewish festival and Christianity and Christian, and it wasn't just a Passover, but it was what he was about to say to begin the new, I guess, new festival for the Jews. It would have been a new festival, a new beginning, right, of something new that didn't involve Judaism, right? But it would have been the replacement of it. So in verse 18, we see Jesus foretelling the disciples that a disciple will betray him while they were eating. Right? It says, one of you will betray me. Now imagine being a leader of a group, knowing that somebody in that group was going to turn you over. Right? Somebody was going to turn you over to death. There would have to be a very good reason not to beat that man up. Right? What Peter did in the Garden of Gethsemane is probably what Judas deserved. The man having his ears cut off. They probably should have cut off Judas's head. Right? I mean, if Peter would have known that this was going to be Judas's actions, can you imagine what Peter would have done to Judas? Can you imagine the blood? It wouldn't have been the blood of Christ. It would have been the blood of Judas. Right? If Peter had known in advance that it was Judas that was going to do it, perhaps that was the reason why Christ hid the fact that it was Judas. He didn't even say who it was. In verse 19 it says, and they began to be grieved and say to him one by one, not I. Right? So they all denied it. It's not me, Lord. I don't feel that way toward you. I don't feel betrayal. Right? So they all denied it. And in verse 20 it says, and he said to them, it is one of the 12, one who dips with me in the bowl. So he gave them a clue. Right? He didn't tell them who, but he gave them a clue. And he says, it's the one that the betrayer is the one that's going to put his hands in the bowl as I do at the same time. When he dips his hand, when I dip my hand, he dips his hands. He's going to do what I do. Right? But he's on the other side. Right? so this betrayer would dip his hands in the bowl as he did. I went to a church not too long ago, and when we took communion, we had to dip the bread into the wine or the juice. And it dawned on me, and I thought, well, wasn't that what Judas did to betray Jesus? But then I thought, wait a minute, it was Jesus who did it, but it was Judas who followed. So Judas was still following Christ, even at the table, right? While they were eating Passover. What a mystery, into the heart of this disciple. And we see in verse 21 that, and then Jesus makes the statement here, and he says, for the Son of Man is to go, as it is written of him. As it is written of him. He calls himself the Son of Man. Right? The Son of Man. He didn't say, and the Son of God, for the Son of God is to go. He says, no, it's the Son of Man. Because as the Son of God, they wouldn't have had the power to do to him. Because we see later on, he says, after Peter cuts off the ears of Malchus, he says, do you think that I can't appeal to my Father to send legions of angels? That's the Son of God. But the Son of Man is where he has to do what? He has to humble himself to the point of death, even death on the cross. Right? Which is what I think Paul writes about. So he says, for the Son of Man is to go, just as it is written of him. And then he says, but woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. So Jesus again foretells that his death is to fulfill what has been written by the Old Testament prophets. Right? Prophet Isaiah. And we know that it's also in the minor prophets. Right? It's also in the minor prophets. Some of the writings about his death and things. He cursed the man chosen to betray him, to turn against him. Right? His non-existence would have been best. It would have been better if this man had never been born. Right? It would have been good for that man if he had not been created by God. To know and to think that this man was made to lead the murder of Messiah. What a terrible, terrible, terrible pressure, right? To be under this kind of, imagine the mother of John the Baptist gave birth to Forerunner. The mother of Jesus gave birth to Messiah, but then the mother of Judas gave birth to the betrayer. And all these years that boy grew up. His parents, they weren't even aware of the catastrophe and the misery that he was going to bring the Son of God. That he was going to be a wicked man. A man after Satan's heart. We know that in Luke chapter 22. Luke chapter 22. Luke says in verse 3, and Satan entered into Judas, who was called Iscariot, belonging to the number of the 12. Satan entered into Judas. Imagine that. In Acts, actually in Matthew, Jesus, when he was enduring the temptations, stood before Satan and fought against Satan and tested Satan and tried Satan and caused Satan to stumble. And from verses 1 all the way down to verse 11, it says that the devil left him, and behold, angels came and began to minister to him. At one point, the scripture says that Satan had offered or asked him to bow down to him. And Jesus said no. Absolutely not. Right? Satan had offered him the whole world. And Jesus said no. He says, all these things I will give you if you fall down and worship me. And Jesus' response is, get out of here. right? Because you're only supposed to worship God and serve him only. And here, Satan comes and sit at his table where he's having supper with his disciples. So we go from Matthew, where Satan enters the heart of the king, Herod, to have him slain. And then we see Satan approaching him directly to ask him to worship him. And then again we see Satan approaching him again through Judas. Right? Satan approaches him through Judas to sit at his table, and then later on to betray him. And then we'll see Satan again condemning him to crucifixion and death. So from the very beginning, this has been the marring of Satan, from Genesis to Matthew, and from Matthew to Mark. Satan is the master of disguise, the master disaster, the one whose spirit is to kill Christ. The disciple is probably not even aware of what he's doing, or maybe he is. But Satan is in that man, controlling him, sort of like Acts 16. Right? Sort of like Acts 16. So there's another side to the new covenant, and the other side is the acts of the devil and what he's been doing, what he has done. Right? So if we were to summarize verses 17 through 21, we see that Jesus leads the disciples to a permanent division. Right? A permanent division. 3 times. The division is that those who are with him and those who are against him. That's the first one. The second division is the practice of a new covenant from an old covenant. Right? Number 3 is the new house of worship and the old house of worship. That is without the evil one. Right? Remember, the temple was sabotaged by the Jewish market or the Roman marketplace. So is this new place with Judas and Satan. So Jesus, after dealing with the disciples, or after dealing with the people in the temple, turning over the table of the money changers and making a whip and cleansing the temple, now he says, we need our own place, guys, because look at what they're doing. And as soon as he said it, we need our own place, that's what Satan decides to do. He goes into Judas Iscariot. As soon as Jesus, and remember, Judas was right there when Jesus was making the plans with the disciples to have a wife. So he switched houses. Right then and there, the devil switched houses. He went from the synagogue, and where all the where the Jews were, where the marketplace was taking place. I mean, anywhere where God is dishonored, Satan is there. Right? We'll see later on how the devil and his demons come out against Jesus. Well, in this situation again. So we see a division here, permanent division. Jesus doesn't take the disciples back to the synagogue. He gives them their own place. Right? We see that a new covenant is going to be established, no longer under the old covenant. Now it's a whole new house of worship. And there's a division between those who are with him and those who are against him. Those who are with him are the disciples. Those who are against him are filled and sealed with Satan. For a person to be against Jesus Christ, the Son of God, he has to be what? Like a Judas, filled with Satan, as we saw in Luke 22. For a man to say Jesus is accursed is to say what? He belongs to the devil. Any man. It doesn't have to be Satan himself. It could be a demon. Right? It could be a demon. We see in Mark 14, 22 through 25, Jesus at Passover dinner establishing a new covenant. So verse 22 through 25, Mark says this. It says, and while they were eating, he took some bread, and after a blessing he broke it and gave it to them and said, take it, this is my body. And he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, and they all drank from it. And he said to them, this is my blood of the covenant, which is to be shed on behalf of many. Truly I say to you, I shall never again drink of the fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new in the kingdom of God. Right? So Jesus, and of course I didn't take bread, but in our day we use the cracker. Right? This is the body of Christ. Right? This is the body of Christ to the churches. And some are even smaller than this. And this is the cup. Right? This is the cup that we use in the church. So we see in verse 22, during dinner, Jesus took bread, blessed it, and gave it to them to eat, calling the bread his body. Right? This is what he considered his body. Now they've been eating this for 3.5 years with fish. Right? They even fed it to thousands. Not once did he ever make reference to it as his body, except for at this hour. And then in verse 23, he took a cup, right? Jesus took the cup that he was drinking from, right? Probably a cup of wine, blessed it, and gave it to them to drink, calling it what? His blood. Calling it his blood. So verse 24, Jesus said, the cup is his blood of the new covenant, like the bulls and the goats, is to be shed for many for the atonement of sin. Right? So verse 24, this is the blood of the covenant, which is to be shed on behalf of many. Right? So this is symbolic. It's not literally him puncturing himself. Right? It's not literally him sticking a needle or a knife in his hands and then just dripping it into the cup. Right? So this isn't like a cut in the hands and Jesus going, okay, now go ahead and drink some of this. That's not what he's saying here. He takes the fruit of the vine, which is the grape juice, or the wine, and the bread, and he says, this is my body, and this is my blood. And as long as you do this in remembrance of what I'm about to suffer. Now, the Jews didn't do that. Judaism didn't practice that. What Judaism did was they took the animal and they killed the animal, right? And the animal's flesh was sacrificed and the animal's blood was spilled. Now Jesus is saying, enough of the animal, now it's my turn. Right? So let's do this now. This is what Christians have been doing since Christ had left to identify with this passage of Scripture. This is what Christians all over the world are known to do, eating the bread and drinking the cup of the new covenant and meeting in their own houses. Right? We don't have to go to the house of, we don't have to go to the synagogue anymore. We meet in his name. We preach his message of repentance. In Matthew 4, when he comes out, he says, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Right? We come out as the church, right? Wearing an armor, spiritual armor. We are standing alert and preparing ourselves in every generation, right, for the adversary. And we don't know how the adversary is going to come. It could be through a member of our family. It could be through a government official, a king. We don't know. But however he comes, we're prepared, right? We have a message. We have a new name. That's our new name. That's our new message. That's our new stance, right? And he says, carry your cross daily. Always be ready, right? And this is the sword of the Spirit, the Word of God. So, verse 25, Jesus promised not to ever drink it, not to ever drink wine again until he could drink it with the disciples in the new kingdom of God. Right? So now, look at this. A new covenant, a new kingdom, a new place of worship. Everything is being made new. It's a whole new world for the Jews who are on his side. And it is the same old world for the Jews that are what? Behind Judas, under Satan. What a hit against Judaism. To think the law that the Jews stood for and all this time, right? The Jewish law, the sacrifice of the animals. And yet Satan is using them at this hour to do what? To betray the Son of God, to betray God incarnated in human flesh. I mean, it's like Israel under Satan, maybe that was the reason why they were so stubborn. Maybe that was the reason why they went back into captivity for 70 years. Maybe that's the reason why as soon as they left Egypt, they made a calf. Maybe that's the reason why they were bitten by snakes. Maybe that's the reason why there was so much immorality among them. Because Satan was ravishing them with his demons. And he would not allow them to live a sanctified, godly life unto God. He wouldn't leave them alone. Because they were the people of God. So if we were to conclude and summarize verses 22 to 25, we see that Jesus established for his church a new covenant, for a new kingdom, excluding Israel, right? Unless, there's a condition, unless they believed and received him as God, as Messiah, and as King. In which we will see in the coming verses, they rejected him as God, they rejected him as Messiah, and they rejected him as King. So we want to move to Mark 14:26, where Jesus led the disciples to worship and to the Mount of Olives, right? So here we go from the Garden of Eden in Genesis 3 to the Mount of Olives, to the Garden of Olives, right? The Mount of Olives, which is also a garden, right? So from death of man to the death of God in the garden, to the death of the incarnated God, God incarnated in the garden. So from garden to garden, where Satan led man to death, and now here he is again about to lead man to death. But this time he's leading God to death, right? So we see in verse 26, Mark says, and after singing a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives, right? They went out to the Mount of Olives. So Jesus sang a hymn. He worshiped God the Father. And then Jesus led the disciples to the Mount of Olives in a garden where he would be praying with the disciples. All right? How can you summarize one verse of Scripture? All right? It was a repeat. When you look at Genesis 3, in the Garden of Eden, Satan beguiled Eve to betray the commands of God. The reason why I say how can you conclude one verse is because here in my Bible, after verse 26, you know how like the Bible has these little black numbers, and then underneath it is the explanation of the passage, and then there's several passages underneath, and then to kind of give you the story, and then the next little black number gives you a whole new set of circumstances. Okay, well in my Bible here, verse 26 is what? Black. And verse 27 is black. So that's why I say, how do you summarize verse 26? Because all it says is, and after singing a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. And for Mark, that was loaded. And probably for the scholars too. Right? And basically, what I could gather from that passage is that what? It was a repeat of Genesis 3. Right? In the Garden of Eden, Satan beguiled Eve to betray the commands of God by eating the fruit. And now Satan is going to use Judas to betray God in his incarnation, right? Trying to redeem the first hit of betrayal where it began in a garden. So the whole purpose of Jesus being on the earth, it was to do what? To redeem what was done in the Garden of Eden, which was to betray God. The woman betrayed God, and man has been enduring the wrath of God all this time. Jesus comes now into the scene to do what? To take the hit. But who is he? He is God incarnate. Right? He is God incarnate. Trying to redeem the first hit, which was done against man, but he had to take the position of man to remove it from the woman. Right? So now again, the situation has to be redeemed from the garden. So from garden to garden. So now Satan uses Adam and his sons to betray God and lead to his death. Having a hard time reading my notes. That's the reason why it's taking so long here. That's what it was. What I was trying to say is that now remember in the garden, right? When Eve ate the fruit, it led to the death of all men. Right? It led to the death of all men. And what Jesus has to do is he has to redeem that hit from the garden, from the first garden. That's why he's in the second garden. So it's almost like we have to go back to the garden scene again to redeem the hit that was done against Adam and all his sons. Right? The hit of betrayal. Now it's God had to be betrayed again and lead to his death. But this time, his death leads to what? Eternal life. Does that make sense? Remember in Genesis 2:17, the promise of God to Adam and Eve was, if you eat of the fruit, you shall surely die. The serpent heard it and betrayed God by leading the woman to commit the act in the Garden of Eden. Now God waits all this time and watches the sons of Adam die over the course of time. He comes up with a plan to go back into the garden, and in the garden, where he knew the devil would be, what does he do? Betrayal takes place again, a second time. And who's leading those people to this betrayal? Satan himself in the body of Judas. In the body of Judas. But this time, the death is on God incarnated, leading not to the death of all men, but to the salvation of all men, and to them receiving eternal life if they believe in his death and resurrection. So we see here in this passage the Mount of Olives, right? They sing a hymn, and then Jesus leads them to the Mount of Olives, a garden, right? The Garden of Gethsemane. When you look at Mark 14, verses 27 to 31, Jesus warned the disciples of their falling away, and that includes Peter. Verse 27 through 31 says this, and Jesus said to them, you will all fall away, because it is written, I will strike down the shepherd, and the sheep shall be scattered. Right? I will strike down the shepherd, and the sheep shall be scattered. But after I have been raised, I will go before you to Galilee. But Peter said to him, even though all may fall away, yet I will not. Right? I will not. And Jesus said to him, truly I say to you, that you yourself this very night, before a cock crows twice, shall 3 times deny me. But Peter kept saying insistently, even if I have to die with you, I will not deny you. And they all were saying the same thing too. So Mark records what happens here, that Jesus prepares the disciples for their real response when they see what's about to happen to him, right? In verse 27, Jesus foretold the disciples that they were going to fulfill the words of Zechariah 13 verse 7, right? Zechariah is an Old Testament minor prophet, and Jesus quotes him by saying, I will strike down the shepherd, and the sheep shall be scattered. So what is going to happen? Jesus says, I have fulfilled this, right? This is what's going to happen with me. And when it happens, the words of Zechariah the prophet will have been fulfilled. In Zechariah 13, verse 7, right? In Zechariah 13, verse 7, Zechariah says, awake, O sword, against my shepherd. Right? And I think Zechariah here may be quoting Isaiah and Ezekiel. Right? And maybe even Micah. So it's like one prophet quoting another. And so we see that Zechariah here says, awake, O sword, against my shepherd, and against the man, my associate, declares the Lord of hosts. Strike the shepherd, that the sheep may be scattered, and I will turn my hand against the little ones. So in Isaiah 53:4, Zechariah is quoting Isaiah 53:4, which says, surely our griefs he himself bore, and our sorrows he carried, yet we ourselves esteem him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. Strike the shepherd, that the sheep may be scattered. So Jesus was smitten of God and afflicted. And Zechariah said, strike the shepherd, and that the sheep may be scattered. Even though Isaiah didn't make mention of the sheep, but yet Zechariah quotes him, knowing that the shepherd will be struck. And here Jesus quotes Zechariah as Zechariah quotes Isaiah. He says, I will strike down the shepherd, and the sheep shall be scattered. Right? So after his arrest, they, in fear, will run for cover. Right? They will run for cover. In verse 28, again Jesus foretells, or he foretold, that after his death, he will come back to life and proceed them to the Sea of Galilee. Right? So after he comes back to life, after he resurrects, Jesus is going to go ahead of them into Galilee, which is where he will meet them. I think that this is where he actually prepares fish for them to eat at the Sea of Galilee. We see that in the Gospel of John. And he calls them to come and eat, and they go to him. And that's where Peter is called to shepherd my sheep, and feed my lamb, and feed my sheep. After he had repented of his sin, Jesus had forgiven him. And in verse 29 it says, but Peter said to him, even though all may fall away, yet I will not. So here, Jesus tells them two things. He tells them, one, they're going to fall away, but then he doesn't tell them what's going to happen in Galilee. It's in Galilee that he redeems them, and he restores them. And he restores Peter. Here in the Garden of Gethsemane, when he's arrested, after the whole incident, he's going to deny Christ 3 times at the very end of the chapter. But then when he meets them in Galilee, that's when he's going to restore Peter. And this is what this verse is talking about here. In verse 28, he prepares them for it. So Peter denounces, though, that he will fall away, right? That he's determined to remain as a supporter of Jesus no matter what occurs. Right? His spirit is, I don't care. I'm staying with him. Doesn't matter what happens. And in verse 30, Jesus foretells Peter, before a rooster crows twice, he will deny him. Right? 3 times. So the rooster crows, Peter denies, and then the rooster crows again. So Jesus tells them, right? This was the This was the last night with him, the last supper, the last fellowship, the last hymn, the last everything to fulfill Scripture's promises. Right? And Jesus is a man of his word. But Peter in verse 31 promises that he will remain faithful even to the point of death. Right? And so did the other disciples. They believed Christ, they believed Peter. And everybody was sticking together except for the one man, Judas Iscariot, who could not be there with them at that time. My heart feels for Judas because I don't think he was expecting this to be the end of it. Right? I don't think this was the grand finale that he was hoping for. How sad. Right? Of all the men, Satan entered this one. And speaking of Satan, I was sleeping here the other day, and something came upon me, and I think it was the devil himself. And the only two words that the devil spoke to me was, okay. Okay. And I thought, my God, that is in the spirit that, I mean, it felt like the spirit of like an evil spirit had come upon me, not in me, but upon me, right, close enough to my ear to where I could hear it. I could hear this wind blowing, and I could feel the spirit of the devil. So, to conclude and to summarize verses 27 to 31, we see the fulfillment of Scripture was more important to Jesus than his own life. The fulfillment of Scripture was more important to Jesus than his own life. Right? Than his own life. He valued the importance of his promises through the prophets. He didn't go back on his word. If he said it, he did it. And now they were at the hour of it coming to pass. Just like in Mark 13:31. Right? His words will never pass away. So here, if we want to go back to Mark 13, right? What did Jesus say? Not only did he say, be on the alert, but he says, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words they will not pass away. I mean, heaven will fall and earth will be destroyed, but my words remain. It will be accomplished as I have said it. He is a man and a God of his word. If he said it, he will do it. And now they are at the hour of it coming to pass. We look at Mark 14:32 through 42. And Jesus at Gethsemane prays and tries to flee his betrayers. Right? Jesus is at the Garden of Gethsemane and he prays. So verses 32 through 42, Scripture says this. And they came to a place named Gethsemane. It's called the Garden of Gethsemane. And he said to his disciples, sit here until I have prayed. And he took with him Peter, James, and John, the same three that he took to the Mount of Transfiguration. And we see in earlier chapters. And began to be very distressed and troubled. Now, remember in Isaiah talked about him being distressed, right, and troubled, preparing us for this. Now, what we read in Isaiah, we are now experiencing right here in this passage. So in verse 34, Mark says, and he said to them, my soul is deeply grieved to the point of death. Remain here and keep watch. And he went a little beyond them and fell to the ground and began praying that if it were possible, the hour might pass him by. Right? And he was saying, Abba, Father. Right? Abba, meaning Father. All things are possible for thee. Remove this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what thou wilt. And he came and found them sleeping and said to Peter, Simon, are you asleep? Could you not keep watch for 1 hour? Keep watching and praying that you may not come into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. And again he went away and prayed, saying the same words. And again he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were very heavy, and they did not know what to answer him. And he came the third time and said to them, are you still sleeping and taking your rest? It is enough. The hour has come. Behold, the Son of Man is being betrayed into the hands of sinners. Into the hands of sinners. Verse 32. So Jesus took the disciples to Gethsemane to pray, to converse with the Father. Remember, in Matthew 6, Jesus taught them how to pray, Our Father which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. Forgive us of our debts as we forgive our debtors. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever and ever. Amen. Deliver us from evil. Thy will be done. Now you take that passage in Matthew 6 and compare it to what is happening right here in this Garden of Gethsemane. Or you can go to John chapter 17, which is Jesus' priestly prayer, where John tells you exactly what Jesus has prayed. We'd be here all day if I did that, if I switched over to John, to show you exactly what he prayed, which is completely different than what he had said in that prayer in Matthew 6 when he taught the disciples to pray. Thy will be done. Right? Father who is in heaven. So here he's consulting heaven. And he brought the three closest disciples with him to come and to converse with the Father. But remember, on the Mount of Transfiguration, they didn't sleep. They were so shocked that the Father was there. This time, the Father didn't come out. We see in other Gospels that the Father sent an angel to minister. So he did respond. In verse 33, we see that Jesus separated the three of the disciples to go with him in his time of distress, while his soul was troubled and grieved, right? Foreseeing the coming of pain, of his pain in the flesh. Right? Before, it's like you start wincing, knowing how painful this thing is going to be in his humanness. Right? He had to release the divine side and set it aside so he could deal with his humanity and the misery that he was about to suffer before these people. Right? So he took 3 comforted disciples. And you could read the letters or the epistles of Peter, James, and John. Right? And some of them make reference to a lot of what Jesus taught, and even this hour here. Right? Peter, actually, I'll talk about it in a minute. But he took the 3 with him. He left the others, but he left the other 9, actually the other 8. Judas was making money and with the sinners, and he had 3 with him. And in verse 34, he confesses to them and says to them, my soul is deeply grieved to the point of death. So he tells them, stay here and keep watch, keep an eye out, right? Because the devil's coming. Keep an eye out because the devil's coming. He tells them that he's grieved to the point of death. He could have yielded his spirit, without the brutality. On the cross, he yielded his spirit, the Bible says. Here, right here, at that hour, he could have yielded his spirit and fallen flat on his face. Right? He could have yielded his spirit, but he chose not to. In verse 35, the Bible says that he went a little beyond them and fell to the ground and began praying that if it were possible, the hour might pass him, but he could have fallen to the ground and died and yielded his spirit right then and there, and it would have accomplished the same thing, but his blood wouldn't have been spilled. We see that blood was spilled in the passage, but it was the wrong blood. So he had to restore the ear back and the blood back into the head. No, wrong person. I'm the one that has to take that hit. So Jesus fell to the ground to pray that the hour would what? Skip him. Like the Passover lamb. Right? Like the Passover blood. The spirit of death would not touch him. Not wanting to die. Not wanting to be hit unto death. Not wanting the blows that are coming. Right? The hit of death. In verse 36 it says, and Jesus was saying, Abba, meaning Father. And that's a Hebrew word. All things are possible for you. Right? All things are possible. Remember, Jesus says, apart from me, you can do nothing. Right? And here, Jesus says, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what thou wilt. He asked the Father to remove it. Here's the cup. Right? Remove it from me, he says. If it's your will, if that's what you want. Again, an example of his humility, even to the point of death. Right? He asked the Father to remove it. This is his predetermined death. We've been talking about his death since Genesis. Right? Since Genesis, we've been talking about this death. And here it is right here on the threshold of the hour. But only if it were his own will, not Jesus' will. In other words, Jesus himself says, it's not my choice. It's your choice if this is what you want. If this is what you're still requiring. If you're still requiring for blood to be shed, it has to be mine. Because it's my blood that's going to restore them and give them eternal life. The blood of Malchus was not the blood. It's my blood. Right? So we see in verse 36, nor the blood of Judas, who should have probably been killed as a result of what he did, but neither Judas nor Malchus, but it had to be the blood of Christ that cleanses us from all sin. So verse 37, we see that Jesus came and found them sleeping again. He found them sleeping and said, Peter, are you asleep? Could you not keep watch for 1 hour? He asked them, he waked them up, and he says, hey, are you guys sleeping on a job? So he found Peter, James, and John resting, wondering if they could keep watch for the devil and his angels. He wanted them to be alert. You see, he knew that Satan was coming. He knew that Satan was coming with ammunition. He knew that Satan was coming. And it wasn't that he was afraid for himself. I think he was more afraid for the disciples because he told them that they were going to scatter. No matter what happened, he was going to have to yield to the devil. No more running. No more running to Egypt. Right? No more dodging bullets. Now the hour is here. And I will humbly surrender. So he knew the devil was coming, and the devil wanted his blood. It was the devil who wanted his blood. Satan has been wanting the position of God, the worship of God, the humility of God, since they were in heaven. Satan has been wanting God, and God says, I can only give it to you in human flesh. No other way. I can only give it to you in incarnation, in human flesh. Can you spill my blood? Because after this, there's going to be a period of time. But when God gives it back to Satan, he goes into the abyss, and then he goes into the lake of fire. So God does give back these hits. Right? In other words, we have to agree to disagree. We have to agree, okay, I'll take the hit first, but then I have to give it back to you. And when I give it back to you, it's for eternity. Because you've spilled my blood using these men. And you've humiliated me. You've humiliated me in heaven. You've humiliated me in Genesis. You've humiliated me throughout creation. You've humiliated me in my birth. And now this is the final hour. I'll give my blood to you. So, in the body of a fallen man, Satan was going to come and arrest him. Verse 38, Jesus says, keep watching and praying that you may not come into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Right? So Jesus instructs them. He tells them to keep an eye out. Right? And to join him in prayer. Pray to the Father. Speak to him as I'm speaking to him. So that they would not fall into temptation. Right? They would not fall into trial, testing. Because the spirit is willing. The spirit wants to be alert, but the body wants to sleep. Right? The temptation here is to rest and not to be on the alert at all. And not even be aware of the devil's coming. You know, that's why later on, Peter writes in 1 Peter 5:8 that the devil prowls around like a roaring lion seeking someone to devour. Be on the alert. When you go to 1 Peter 5:8, you know, when Satan finally comes in the form of Judas, it's like, whoa, you're kidding me? This actually is for real. Yes. So he takes out a knife and literally almost cuts the guy's head off. But the warning here is that temptation is near and at the door. Remember, Cain, sin was crouching at his door, and God had given him a warning, but he didn't listen, or he didn't heed the warning, and the result of it was what? He ended up killing what? Abel. Here again, God is giving a warning to the disciples. Not that sin is crouching at the door, but Satan is coming. In verse 39, we see again he went away and prayed, like before when he fell down, saying the same words, repeating the same words that he had repeated to the Father. So I guess we can repeat the words until we're sure that God has heard us. Right? So Jesus went back to pray, giving them, that is, the 3 disciples that were with him, the same warnings. And he probably instructed the other 8, you know, to keep an eye out in the distance, right? To watch out for him and 3, and to remain in prayer. And in verse 40 it says, and again he came and found them what? Sleeping, for their eyes were very heavy, and they did not know what to answer him. So the temptation to fall asleep was upon them because their bodies were weak. So he comes back and he finds them sleeping again. And they were speechless. They didn't have anything to say. It's like, well, what do you expect? You know, it's nighttime. Or it's late. Unable to explain why they couldn't remain awake and on the alert. Figure out how many of us have been caught off guard. I mean, I get caught off guard all the time. I get hits all the time. Cuts and piercings because I can't keep my eyes open. Once my body hits a certain time, I'm done. I go to sleep, regardless. Come, you know, bad dreams, good dreams, life and death, hits, hurts, pain, cuts, whatever is coming, electrocution. It's time for the body to rest. God has made it that way. Verse 41. And he came the 3rd time, so the 3rd time he comes, and he says to them, are you still sleeping and taking your rest? And then he says, it's enough. The hour has come. Behold, the Son of Man is being betrayed into the hands of sinners. Okay, that's it. He's here. Right? So Jesus came a 3rd time and found them resting and warned them the hour of betrayal has come. Right? He is to be turned over to the sinners and removed from the saints. So now, just like Judas made the switch, so Jesus has to make the switch. Now, just like he was in the hands of his church and his new saints, now he has to be put in the hands of the wicked and the enemy, so that they can do all these wicked things to him that he has said they were going to do. So now he has to switch from the company of saints to the company of sinners. Right? And verse 42 says, arise, let us be going. Behold, the one who betrays me is at hand. So he warns them in 42, right? And invites them to come. Right? Let's go. The betrayer is approaching. Satan is coming with an army of people. And he's not coming by himself. Probably every single one of those people had a devil in them. Probably every single one of those people had a demon, and probably Satan would have confirmed that the demons were inside of the bodies of these people. Why should he be only in the body of Judas and the rest not be filled with demons, legions? Remember that one passage in the Gospel of Matthew, I think it is, where there's a legion of demons that were in swines, right? Or that were in they were in this man. And they asked Jesus to put them into swines. And so Jesus took the legion of demons that was in this one man and put them in the swine, and the swine fell into the ravine. Right? We read about this earlier in the Gospel of Mark. And so, you know, when you look at a passage like this of these people coming with anger and rage, right, to arrest Jesus, you have to keep in mind that these people are probably filled with the devil in them and with the demons of hell in them. So if we were to summarize and conclude these verses 32 to 42, we see that the human side of Jesus, he didn't want to die unless it remained the Father's will. It was something that he had to do by himself, right? And the disciples couldn't even stay awake to pray with him. The disciples could not stay awake. Unfortunately, but they couldn't. Looks like the sun is going down now, so it's getting later. It's already 5 o'clock. Right? But we're almost done. We only have a few more verses. Right? I wanted to do this chapter all at once because that's how I've done the whole book. If in the future I ever do it again, I'll probably take it verse by verse. But it won't take me months. It might take me a year to do the entire thing. Because there's a lot of information there that I'm skipping over. And I know that there are others who have done the Gospels. And when you take the Gospels and you compare it to the Old and the New Testament, it's rich. It's incredible. There's a lot in there. I'm just not touching it. I'm just flying through this right now. And we come to Mark 14, 43 to 50. Jesus betrayed by Judas, arrested, and the disciples flee, fulfilling his words. Right? So 43 through 50, Mark says this, and immediately while he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, came up, accompanied by a multitude with swords and clubs from the chief priests and the scribes and the elders. Now he who was betraying him had given them a signal, saying, whomever I shall kiss, he is the one. Seize him and lead him away under guard. And after coming, he immediately went up to him, saying, Rabbi, and kissed him. And they laid hands on him and seized him. But a certain one of those who stood by drew his sword and struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his ear. And Jesus answered and said to them, have you come out with swords and clubs to arrest me, as though I were a robber? Every day I was with you in the temple teaching, and you did not seize me. But this has happened, that the scriptures might be fulfilled. Again, the scriptures being fulfilled. First it was the scriptures of Isaiah and Zechariah. And now here he is again saying so that the scriptures might be fulfilled. Right? And they all left him and fled. So we see in 43 that Judas led a mob with weapons to where Jesus was with the disciples. Right? The group represented Jewish leaders. If you go to John 18 verse 3, John 18:3, John was there, and in John 18:3 the scripture says that actually I'm going to read from verse 1 to verse 3. It says, when Jesus had spoken these words, he went forth with his disciples over the ravine of the Kidron, where there was a garden, into which he himself entered and his disciples, that is the Garden of Gethsemane. Now Judas also, who was betraying him, knew the place, for Jesus had often met there with his disciples. You see, here it is. For Jesus had often met there with his disciples. So Judas snitched and went and told them exactly where they usually meet. Right? So Judas then, having received the Roman cohort and officers from the chief priests and the Pharisees, came there with lanterns and torches and weapons. So Judas received the Roman cohort and the officers and the chief priests and the Pharisees with weapons. And we see in verse 4, he says, Jesus, therefore, knowing all the things that were coming upon him, went forth and said to them, Whom do you seek? And they answered him, Jesus the Nazarene. He said to them, I am he. And Judas also, who was betraying him, was standing with them. When therefore he said to them, I am he, they drew back and fell to the ground. Again, therefore, he asked them, Whom do you seek? And they said to him, Jesus the Nazarene. Jesus answers, I told you that I am he. If therefore you seek me, let these go their way, that the word might be fulfilled which he spoke of. Those whom thou hast given me, I lost not one. Simon Peter, therefore, having a sword, drew it, and struck the high priest's slave, and cut off his right ear. And the slave's name was Malchus. Jesus therefore said to Peter, Put the sword into the sheath. The cup which the Father has given me, shall I not drink it? So we see here in John chapter 18, as we've just read from verses 3 to verse 11, Jesus brought a mob of the Jewish leaders and the Roman cohort to come and arrest Jesus. In verse 44 in the Gospel of Mark, Mark says, Now he who was betraying him had given them a signal, saying, Whomever I shall kiss, he is the one, seize him and lead him away under guard. So you have to sort of combine all four Gospels together to get a full picture of what took place. We see that a lot in the movies of Jesus' life. So in verse 44, the sign established by the betrayer, that is Judas, was a kiss. That the one whom he kisses would be the one that they would take away under heavy guard. So in verse 45, Judas approached Jesus, calling him rabbi or teacher, and kissed him. Right? Verse 45. And in verse 46, they laid hands on him, they grabbed him, and took Jesus into captivity. Right? They took Jesus into captivity. Remember that in Eden, God and the angels removed Adam and Eve. And in Genesis, and we see that in Genesis 3:4. So here, again, the one who has been betrayed, or the one involved in betrayment, has been removed out of the garden again. The first time it was Adam and Eve because they betrayed God. But now it's Jesus, the incarnated God, who's being removed again out of a garden. Sort of like a mirror image, right? The two gardens, betrayal took place, removal was done, the angels were involved, right? We see in other passages of Scripture that other Gospels that the angels did come and they ministered to Christ. But in the Garden of Eden, we see that the angels stood there with a flaming sword, right? So in both gardens, there was betrayal, there was a removal, and there were angels. And you look at verse 47, so it's sort of like a reenactment, just different people. And God now more involved as the human subject, right? Verse 47 says, But a certain one of those who stood by drew his sword and struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his ears. And we read that in John's Gospel, that it was Peter who cut off the ear of Malchus, the slave of the high priest Caiaphas, right? And we see that in Matthew 26:51 through 54, Luke 27:51, and in John 19:10. John 19:10. John 18, not 19:10, but correction, John 18:10. I wrote 19:10, but John 18:10. So these are the passages where you can read about the account of that we're reading right now in Mark's Gospel. Matthew 26:51 through 54, and And verse 52, which I think is a significant passage, says, Then Jesus said to him, Put your sword back into the sheath, for all those who take up the sword shall perish by the sword. And then verse 53 says, Or do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? How then shall the scriptures be fulfilled that it must happen this way? And at that time, Jesus said to the multitude, Have you come out with swords and clubs to arrest me as though I were a robber? Every day I used to sit in the temple teaching, and you did not seize me. So here it is, fascinating words by Jesus. It says, what do you think? I can't appeal to my Father and get 12 legions? I mean, that will just blow away all of these guys right here. Right? Anyway, we see in Mark's Gospel, verse 48, Jesus asked the crowd, why they came to arrest him like a robber, like a thief, stealing, basically stealing the thunder, stealing the thunder and the glory of Rome and the Sanhedrin. I think that's the reason why he uses the word robber there. He says, in verse 48, he says, Have you come out with swords and clubs to arrest me as though I were a robber? What is it that Jesus has stolen? He's stolen the thunder and the glory of Rome and the Sanhedrin. Right? That was their issue. They hated him. Right? They vehemently, they hated him. They hated the son, the uneducated son of the carpenter, who stole their glory, right, with the group, with the multitude. And in verse 49, it says, Every day I was with you in the temple, teaching, and you did not seize me. But this has happened that the scriptures might be fulfilled. So Jesus reminded them that he was a teacher among them, not a robber. I didn't come here to steal your glory, I came to teach you. Right, so Jesus reminded them of his teaching in the temple daily. But now to fulfill scripture, they came to arrest him. And finally in verse 50, they all left him and fled. The disciples took off. Just like he had prophesied that it was going to happen. So the disciples leaving him alone, just as it was said. So if we were to summarize verses 43 to 50, we see that Isaiah 53 was fulfilled. Right? Isaiah 53 was fulfilled. So the entire passage was fulfilled. Isaiah 53 was fulfilled. Verse 3 says, He was despised and forsaken of men, a man of sorrow and acquainted with grief. And like one from whom men hide their face, he was despised, and he did not esteem him. So Isaiah 53 was fulfilled. He was despised by the Sanhedrin. He was forsaken by the disciples. He was grieved. Peter hid his face in shame. Right? He hid his face in shame. He was despised and not esteemed. Here's something that was amazing. In verses 51 through 52 of the passage, it says, a young man flees naked. Right? A certain young man was following him, wearing nothing but a linen sheet over his naked body. And they seized him. Now, when I've read this before, I said, well, I don't understand this. Why would God put this, or why would Mark put this in there? A certain young man was following him, wearing nothing but a linen sheet over his naked body. And they seized him, but he left the linen sheet behind and escaped naked. The more I thought about it, I thought, you know what? This is a picture of Christ. Right? Remember, when Jesus dies, his spirit leaves his naked body in the hands of what? In the hands of sinners. And here the young man flees and leaves his sheep in the hands of sinners. And he runs naked to get away from them because he didn't want to have anything to do with it. This reminds me of a man that I knew. at the mission, the Portland Rescue Mission, when I was homeless. This man would wear nothing but a sheet over his body, even during the winter. Nobody understood it. I didn't. Very seldom did I ever see him with clothes on. And as I read this passage, it reminded me of that young man. The one that I knew was an old man. But in this passage, it's a young man. Right? Verse 51. So from a distance, there was a witness, a young man, naked, homeless, and poor. And they seized him. And being that he was covered with a linen sheet, he pulled free and escaped. He pulled free and escaped. He took off running for his life, not wanting to go to jail. So in conclusion, or in summary of just these two verses, like verse 26, earlier, right? This was a picture of what was going to happen to Jesus. He was to be apprehended, judged, and crucified. Then his naked body would be placed in a tomb, free from life's trials and troubles, buried in a tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. Now, keep in mind that it was Joseph, the husband of Mary, who brought him into the world, right? And Joseph of Arimathea was the one who took his body and placed it in a tomb out of this world. Now, this is unlike Joseph, the son of Jacob, who brought who? I am. To Egypt. Right? It was Joseph, the son of Jacob, who brought I am to Egypt. And here we see Jesus, we see that the sinners caught up and gave it back. Right? They gave it back. What happened when Jesus came in the form of I am, came into Egypt? They were judged. Eventually the relationship ended in judgment. Right? When he was brought to Egypt. But the sinners caught up and they gave it back. And when the sinners caught up and gave it back, it's his life that they take. So Joseph brought him into the house of sinners, and sinners caught up and killed him. It was Joseph who would lay him down in a cave. I guess I'm sort of like playing with the word Joseph, the name Joseph. Right? Joseph brings them into Egypt, and it's Joseph that puts them in the cave. Because remember, Jesus says, before Abraham was, I am. So he was the I am of the Old Testament. And it was the I am who destroyed Egypt. But then, in Egypt were what? A nation of sinners. And now sinners catches up to him. And again, it was a Joseph who laid him in a tomb. Joseph in Egypt brought him, right, to Egypt. And as an infant, Joseph again brought him to Egypt. Twice, two Josephs. And then we see at the end of his life, it was Joseph again who brought him to his grave. Right? So twice Joseph brought him to sinners, and it was Joseph who laid him in the tomb out of the hands of sinners. So Joseph introduced them to the evil Egyptians twice, while he was in heaven and in his incarnation. While he was in heaven, he destroyed Egypt, but in his incarnation, this time, it was the sinners who killed him. This time, when Joseph brought him to Egypt, and when they caught up to him, when the sinners caught up to him, not necessarily the Egyptians, but the Roman Empire, who were also sinners, who probably knew the history of the Egyptians. when they all caught up to him, because remember, the empire was all the countries around the Mediterranean. So they probably knew the history of the Egyptian people. And when they knew that it was the Lord, right? I always wondered if look at Acts chapter 2. See, it says here in Acts chapter 2 that in verse 8 it says, verse 7 it says, and they began to be amazed and to marvel, saying, why are not all these who are speaking Galileans? And how is it that we each hear them in our own language, to which we were born? Parthians, Medes, Elamites, and residents of Mesopotamia, Judea, Cappadocia, Pontus, Asia, Phrygia, Pamphylia, Egypt, and the districts of Libya around Cyrene, and visitors from Rome, both Jews and proselytes. You see that Egypt was numbered there. So the Egyptians were where? The Egyptians were in Israel in the time of Christ. Because the Jews in the Holy Spirit spoke the language of Egypt. Right? And how far back did the Egyptians know the Lord? And this, you mean to tell me, is the Lord that parted the Red Sea and took over Pharaoh? Yes. This is the Lord that destroyed all of our country in Egypt and gave us 10 plagues? Yes. This is the Lord? Yes. The one that was crucified and nailed to a cross? Yes. He came down and yes. So Mark 14, so the sinners caught up and they gave it back. Who knows what Egypt might have said to whisper, right, into the ears of the Roman Empire. Because the empire was also over Egypt, from what I can remember and what I've read in history books. So we see in Mark 14, we have 2 more portions of scripture here, and then we're done with this passage. Long, isn't it? We've been going at this for some time now. You know, God be with you, those of you that are chugging with me here. By now, some people would have turned it off after 5 minutes. So it takes a real trooper to actually stay this long. So I commend you to God. Those of you who love the word and want to hear the preaching of it. So Mark 14:53-65 says this, and they led Jesus away to the high priest, and all the chief priests and the elders and the scribes gathered together, and Peter had followed him at a distance, right into the courtyard of the high priest. And he was sitting with the officers and warming himself at the fire. Now the chief priests and the whole council kept trying to obtain testimony against Jesus, to put him to death, and they were finding none. For many were giving false testimony against him, and yet their testimony was not consistent. And some stood up and began to give false testimony against him, saying, we heard him say, I will destroy this temple made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another made without hands. And not even in this respect was their testimony consistent. And the high priest arose and came forward and questioned Jesus, saying, do you make no answer to what these men are testifying against you? But he kept silent and made no answer. Again, the high priest was questioning him and saying to him, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One? And Jesus said, I am. And you shall see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. And tearing his clothes, the high priest said, what further need do we have of witnesses? You have heard the blasphemy. How does it seem to you? And they all condemned him to be deserving of death. And some began to spit at him, and to blindfold him, and to beat him with their fists, and to say to him, prophesy. And the officers received him with slaps in the face. Wow, what an intense time. So Jesus in verse 53, taken to Annas, right? We see that in John 18:13. And you go to John 18:13, the Gospel here. Scripture says, verse 12, so the Roman cohort and the commander and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him and led him to Annas first, for he was father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. And in verse 14 it says, now Caiaphas was the one who had advised the Jews that it was expedient for one man to die on behalf of the people. Right? So somebody had to die on behalf of the people. That's what Caiaphas had said. Then Caiaphas the high priest and all of the chief priests, that is of the Levitical priesthood, and the elders, those with authority, and the scribes, the scholars, the ones who would write the letters and study the word, they gathered together to conspire against God and to conspire against Christ and to do the will of the devil. Right? We see in Psalms 2, Psalms 2 says this. Psalms 2 says, why are the nations in an uproar and the peoples devising a vain thing? The kings of the earth take their stand, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed. Let us tear their feathers apart and cast away their cords from us. Right? And I just want to look at verse 4 of Psalms 2. It says, he who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord scoffs at them. Then he will speak to them in his anger and terrify them in his fury. Right? But as for me, I have installed my king upon Zion, my holy mountain. And verse 7, he says, I will surely tell a decree of the Lord. He said to me, thou art my son, today I have begotten thee. And so on and so forth. But I thought it was fascinating here in that passage that says the kings of the earth take their stand and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed. Whatever gave these people the right to think for a minute that they could stand against God and his son and win? But in their mindset, that's how they felt. They felt that they were winners and that they could stand against the Son of God and they could stand against God himself. And here we are in this generation, right? The generation of the Psalms was when David and Asaph and Korah were alive among the Jews. But here in this generation, we have the priests, the Levites and the elders of Israel, 70 elders of Israel, new ones, right? And the scribes. And these people, again, forming a mob of Jewish leaders, right? Jesus condemned, abused by these Jewish leaders. And then we see that he prophesied of his second coming. I guess that's how I would summarize the chapter. That Jesus was condemned, abused by Jewish leaders, and prophesied of his second coming. But here they are in verse 53. These groups of men. And it wasn't just like one priest and one elder and one scribe. No, there was a group of them. Group of elders and group of scribes and group of priests. The whole Levitical priesthood was against him. You know, all the elders were against him. Maybe there might have been one or two Pharisees who stood with him, like Nicodemus, who came to visit him. But for the most part, though, the majority of them, they hated him. And they wanted him removed. Even though he fulfilled Scripture, they didn't care. Even though he was fulfilling Scripture, it didn't matter to them. Verse 54 says that Peter followed. Peter followed him at a distance, right into the courtyard of Caiaphas, the high priest. And, you know, he took his position sitting among the Roman officers, warming himself up by the fire, you know. Yeah, it's like, wow, look at me. I'm among the, you know, I'm not just among the Jews, but I'm with the Roman Empire. And so Peter followed them to Caiaphas's house, you know, joining the Romans by the fire. I mean, I guess it must have been winter, or it must have been a cool autumn evening when this occurred. And in verse 55, it says that The whole council, right? When Jesus stood before them, the whole council kept on trying to obtain testimony against him. And the whole, you know how it says in Genesis, every intent of their heart was evil continually. Well, here, every intent of their heart was to put him to death. And they were trying to find testimony, right? They were trying to find testimony. In verse 55 it says, the priest, the Sanhedrin, wanted him killed. So they brought men to testify against him and found no sufficient testimony. They brought men who supported them and their positions to testify against him. Verse 56, it says, for many were given what? Were given false testimony against him, and yet the testimony was not consistent. So many brought false and inconsistent testimonies against him to stand with the priest and the Sanhedrin. You know, they didn't want to stand with God. They didn't want to stand with God's word. Nor did they even remember the Old Testament prophets who warned them of this very thing. They didn't even remember. I mean, you've got a group of Jewish priests, the Sanhedrin, the elders, the people who were most studious, the scribes, with the Pharisees, and yet everything that Christ did never reflected anything that God had said was going to happen in the Old Testament. Right? Never did they associate the works of Christ with the words of the prophets. What Christ actually came to do and actually did do, they never put the two together. That's why I guess they called him a blasphemer when it was all said and done. In verse 57, they stood giving false testimony, lies, words of deception, satanic or demonically influenced. Right? There were men whose tongues were moved by the devil himself. A bunch of wicked, wicked men. So they stood and began to give false testimony against him. And here Mark, what he does is he gives an example of what some of their testimonies were. In verse 58 he says, we heard him say, I will destroy this temple made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another made without hands. That was one of their testimonies that they thought was worthy of death. Verse 58. It wasn't that Jesus murdered someone, beaten someone, robbed someone, stoned someone, raped someone, lied. No. It was, he says he was going to destroy the temple and rebuild it 3 days from then without hands. How can that be worthy of death? But to them it was. They quoted him saying he would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, but not comprehending the context in which he spoke. I think that's what the issue was. Therefore, they condemned him falsely to have been a destroyer and a blasphemer, probably including the turning of the table and the money changers too. Some of them probably testified to that he came into the temple and he destroyed the table of the money changers, and he drove away the animals. They weren't allowed to sacrifice. They probably complained about the fact that he was trying to take away the atonement, right, that they've been practicing for so many years. That was the only way for them to atone for their sins. They didn't understand that he was coming to take away the Old Testament atonement and inaugurating a new one. So, they probably complained about that. That's their testimony, not understanding that that's the position of the Christ. That's the position of the Christ. The purpose of the Christ was to take away these things. That was the position of Messiah. Right? And in verse 59, Mark says, and not even in this respect, this is sarcastic, not even in this respect was their testimony consistent. I mean, these Jews, these people, these leaders, you have no idea what these knuckleheads did, right? I mean, not even in this respect was their testimony consistent, right? I mean, you would not believe what they did to this guy. So in verse 60, right? So Mark says, not even in this testimony, they tell the truth, but remain inconsistent showing Christ no respect. Right? A bunch of tattletellers. Right? A bunch of raconteurs. Recounting things that they did not understand because they didn't have insight. So in verse 60, Mark says this, and the high priest arose and came forward and questioned Jesus, saying, do you make no answer to what these men are testifying against you? So Caiaphas asked Jesus, why is it that you gave no answer? And what were these charges being spoken against you? Right? He wanted Jesus to defend himself and explain these accusations. Not because he stood with Jesus, but because he hated him. Right? So the jealousy of the elders and the priest brought him to this trial. It wasn't because he was defending Christ as Messiah. It wasn't because he embraced Christ as Messiah. For them, it couldn't possibly happen in their day. Right? It couldn't possibly happen in their day. For them. For these men here, it's like, this is ridiculous. I can't believe this is happening. So in verse 61, Jesus kept silent and made no answer. So the high priest went after him again a second time. And again, the high priest was questioning him and saying to him in verse 61, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed? So Jesus stayed quiet, and Caiaphas knew who he was. Or else he wouldn't have asked him. Right? How would he know to ask him such a question? Right? Caiaphas knew who he was. But asked him if he was God's Son, the Christ, the Messiah, the deliverer from sin. As promised by what? By the prophets. Are you the Christ? The one that's going to take away the Old Testament sacrificial system? Are you the one that's going to start a new covenant? Or inaugurate a new covenant in your blood? They knew who he was, but for some reason their spirit could not receive him. Their spirit could not accept him. There is a passage in the Old Testament, in Mark, at the beginning of Mark, where Jesus is speaking to a man who is demon possessed, and in verse 21 it says this, and they went into Capernaum, and immediately on the Sabbath he entered the synagogue and began to teach, teaching them as one having authority and not as the scribes. And just then there was in their synagogue a man with an unclean spirit, and he cried out. That means the man had a demon spirit. And he cried out, saying, what do we have to do with you, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God. The man was where? In the synagogue. Who goes to the synagogue? The Jewish leadership. Right? And Jesus rebuked him, saying, be quiet and come out of him. And throwing him into convulsions, the unclean spirit cried out with a loud voice and came out of him. And they were all amazed, so that they debated among themselves, saying, what is this? A new teaching with authority. He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obeyed him. And immediately the news about him went out everywhere into all the surrounding districts of Galilee. The issue was not the casting out of it. The people's response was his authority, but it wasn't his authority that was in question, it was his identity. But it's not until his trial that they could finally come up to him and ask him to his face, are you the Christ? Because when we were in the temple, in the synagogue, you cast out a demon, and the demon that was in that man told everybody there that what? You were the Christ. You were the Holy One of God. And you came to destroy us. And you responded and told the man to be quiet and come out of it. You shut your mouth. Don't you dare give my identity away. And the man was cleansed. But the issue that what the people did, they made an issue out of his authority and his teaching. But when the Sanhedrin, who was able to discern the spirit, they say, no, this is the spirit of the Christ. This is the spirit of exactly what that demon-possessed man said. They knew that. That's why in this passage here they ask, he asked him point blank. Now it's not about his authority. Now it's not about casting out demons. It's about his identity. Are you the Christ, the Son of the living God? Later on we see they ask him point blank, are you the King of the Jews? Oh my God. They've been wanting to ask him that from as first as he stepped up. I mean, with everything that he's done. But their response is key. In verse 62, Jesus said, I am. And then he upped it up. He didn't say, I am, and waited for an answer. He said, I am. And then look at what he does in verse 62. And you shall see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. How painful is that? It's like somebody taking a dagger and sticking it here once, and then sticking it here twice, and then sticking it here 3 times. Right? Once he says, yes, I am, that's one. The Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power, that's 2. Coming with the clouds of heaven, that's 3. Now he went over their head. He identified with the Old Testament prophets, and then he gave them prophetic words of things to come. Which is what? What is it that he left out here? All of Mark chapter 13. All the warnings about being on the alert. All the destructions that were going to take place. He just went directly into the very end of the chapter and says, I'm coming back. But what is it that he didn't do for the leaders of the Jews? He didn't prepare them. He didn't prepare them as he prepared his disciples. He gave them no warning of what was to come. But he told them, I'm coming. And when I come, I'm going to be sitting at the right hand. You're going to see 2. I'm the one on the right. And I'm going to be sitting next to the what? The hand of power. By the way, that's my Father, and I've introduced my disciples to him. They know all about him. You can ask them. And they know how to talk to him too. You see, it's what he didn't tell them, what he didn't show them, what he didn't reveal to them. So, in verse 62, Jesus says, yes, he was. Then foretold of his second coming with the Father on clouds. That was probably really, really, really painful for them to endure. I mean, that room was probably filled with saints and sinners from corner to corner. I mean, the trial of the era, century. Even John the Baptist didn't live to see this. Right? Even John the Baptist didn't live to see this. Herod would have loved to have seen this. Look who we caught in the end. Right? So in verse 63, Mark says, and tearing his clothes, the high priest said, what further need do we have of witness? That, remember at the beginning, what were they looking for? What were they looking for? Verse 55. He says the whole council kept trying to obtain testimony against Jesus to put him to death. Verse 55, he says, what? The whole council, they were looking and looking and looking. What were they looking for? They were looking for a reason to kill him. And finally, he could hold it in. He says, now, what other evidence do we need to kill this so-and-so? So, verse 63. So Caiaphas tore his clothes. That's symbolic. That's what the Jews do. Sometimes they'll even take dirt and they throw on themselves to show just how remorseful they are. The whole tearing of clothes. I can't believe it. Disbelief. He tore his clothes in disbelief. It's like, what do we, what more? Whew. What do we need more witnesses for to condemn him? We don't need any more witnesses. We don't need any more testimonies. He just did it and gave it himself. He just shot himself in the foot. He just put his foot in his mouth. He just did it right then and there. So we see in verse 64, you have heard the blasphemy. Going back all the way to Mark chapter 1, and all the other times they've been observing him, the only word they could come up with for the answer, I am, and you shall see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven, is, you have heard the blasphemy. They call him a blasphemer. They called him a blasphemer. He cursed and reviled God. Well, the priest and the elders they didn't have anything else to say after that. He says to them, what do you think? How does it seem to you? And they all condemned him to be deserving of death. Verse 55 was fulfilled. Well, we got what we were looking for. The testimony didn't come from all of these people here. It came straight out of his mouth. And that alone deserves death. Because he says that he is the Christ. He says that he is the Messiah. And they couldn't say, well, you have no proof. They couldn't say you have no proof, because his entire 3.5 years was proof. Everything that he did was proof. When that man was healed of his blindness, they brought the man to this group here, and they asked the man's parents, how was your son born? And Jesus and the man, well, the parents were like, well, I don't know, he's of age, won't you ask him? And the man says, well, the man Jesus healed me. Right? He says, the man Jesus healed you. He said, yes, the man Jesus healed me. And they called the man a liar, both him and his parents. You see, there was testimony after testimony, but what was it that was in them that was not allowing them to see the truth? Satan and his demons. You are, in John chapter 8, this is what the issue is with this group. John 8:48, or John 8:48 or 8:24, where he says, you are of your father the devil, and you do the will of your father. Right? I haven't used that passage in a while, but the scripture says that where Jesus condemned them in John 8, when he says to them, you are of your father the devil. And John 8:44 says, you are of your father the devil, and you want to do the desires of your father. He was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in the truth, because there is no truth in him. Whenever he speaks a lie, he speaks from his own nature. He is the liar and the father of lies. But because I speak the truth, you do not believe me. Right? Which one of you convicts me of sin? If I speak truth, why do you not believe me? So this was the issue throughout Christ's life among these people, right? Always fighting with this group here, the Pharisees, and the Sadducees and the Jews, and they would not believe him. They took pride in knowing and being of Abraham, But as far as they were concerned, he himself was of the devil. He himself was of the devil. And no matter what he said, it was blasphemy. And why would they conclude blasphemy? Because of what I just quoted you. Because they were of their father, the devil. The devil had been in him, in them, and his demons were in them before Judas. Right? And perhaps they were influenced by the devil, even though they were committed Jews to the scriptures. These men were so committed to scripture, but yet Jesus caught them so many times. And finally he says to them, you are of your father, the devil. You are not of Abraham. He says, if you were of Abraham, you would believe me. But you do not believe me. And that is the war that you find in John. And he wrestles with them. So verse 65, and some began to spit at him. So not only did he tore his clothes, they called him a blasphemer, they condemned him to death. But verse 65, and they began to spit at him, blindfold him, beat him with their fists, say to him, prophesy. And the officers received him with slaps in the face. So they went crazy. They spat on him, blindfolded him, beat. Asking him, who hit you? Prophesy, you Christ, you imposter. Even after everything he did to convince them otherwise, they would not embrace him. So Jesus discloses his identity as the Christ, and he was rejected with violence against him and condemned him to die. That's basically how I would conclude these verses here. Isaiah, Mark 14:53 to 65. Jesus disclosed his identity as the Christ and was rejected with violence against him and condemned to die. No matter what Jesus did, he could not defend his position. He could not, according to the scriptures. God wants us to make reference to the scriptures because when he says it, he does it. Now, we may think that God is slow in answering prayers, and sometimes I fight with the Lord. Ask my neighbors. Oh, I go to war with him. I fight him. And I get angry when I get hit. It's like, how dare you leave me like this and you let me get hit? Why not kill those people? And they can tell you. I'm like a Peter. I curse and yell. I scream. I shout. I want to scratch him. I want to give me a mouthpiece so I could cut his ears off. But then at the end of the day, I have to ask God to forgive me. So sometimes I feel like I'm standing with this group here. A lot of times Christians feel that way. Like we're standing with this group rather than standing with the scattered disciples. Right? Instead of standing with the scattered, we're standing here with the gathered. Right? Part of my ministry is to gather saints, not to gather a bunch of wicked men. I've been to the gathering of the wicked. And can I give you some description of what I've seen and what I myself have embraced and engaged in? Oh my, God is making a deposit among the wicked, as he has made a deposit among the righteous. And that's for another message. But anyway, let's move on to our last portion of the word, which is in Mark 14:66 through 72. So Peter wept after denying Jesus 3 times. Right? So we see from cockcrow to cockcrow, Jesus is denied by Peter. From cockcrow to cockcrow, Jesus, Peter's, I don't know the man. Stay away from me. I want nothing to do with the man. I'm out of here. Remember the warning that Jesus had given to Peter, right? What was the warning? You live by the sword, you die by the sword. After that, Peter says, you're on your own. I'm out of here. I don't know you. It wasn't before, it was after. After Jesus says, you cannot use the sword, Peter says, then I can't do nothing for you. I can't even keep my words. So, let's read this passage and tie this up. So in verse 66, Mark says this, and as Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came, and seeing Peter warming himself, she looked at him and said, "You too were with Jesus the Nazarene." And he denied it, saying, "I neither know nor understand what you are talking about." And he went out onto the porch. Verse 69, and the maid saw him and began once more to say to the bystanders, This is one of them. But again he was denying it. And after a little while the bystanders were again saying to Peter, "Surely you are one of them, for you are a Galilean too." But he began to curse and swear, "I do not know this fellow you are talking about." And immediately a cock crowed a second time. And Peter remembered how Jesus had made the remark to him, "Before a cock crows twice, you will deny me 3 times." And he began to weep. We've read in the scripture that Jesus wept for his friend Lazarus and rose him up from the grave. And now Peter, next in line, weeps. Why does he weep? Because he denied his Lord. And we know that in Galilee he'll be restored. So verse 66, Peter remained in the courtyard, and the servant of Caiaphas approached him. She called him to the carpet, because she recognized him. But I don't know what he was afraid of, but he wouldn't fess up to saying, "Yeah, I'm one of his disciples, and I don't agree with this trial." He could have said that and walked away and said, "I don't agree with this. This is baloney. I can't believe they did this to this guy. He's been out for 3.5 years. He's done nothing but good. Look at all the people that he's saved. Look at all the people that he's healed, the dead that he's raised, the food that he's fed, all the miracles he did, and this is how they treat him." So that he would not do that, the Lord reminded the disciples that this was to fulfill the scriptures. So he has to go through this. That's why he told them this is to fulfill scripture. This is to fulfill scripture. This is to fulfill scripture. Why? Because he knew of their zeal. Not for himself, but for the Father. The zeal for my Father's house consumed me. Right? And Paul writes that the love of Christ consumes us. We love Christ. Christ loves the Father. And the Father loves us. And he comes and he makes his abode with us through the Holy Spirit. So it's like a love triangle between Father, Son, and Sons, and us. Now, that's for another message. So, verse 67, it says, the servant girl confirmed that Peter was with Jesus the Nazarene. Right? We know in Mark 1:24, I think I read that passage already, but Mark 1:24, go there. It says, "What do we have to do with you, Jesus of Nazareth?" Right? So we know that he was called Jesus of Nazareth by the demon. And here the girl, the servant girl, calls him Jesus the Nazarene. Right? This was the identity of the demons concerning him. The Holy One of God, which Caiaphas said and tried to confirm that the spirit that informed him was this of a demon, was demonic. Remember, I had made mention of this in the last portion of scripture that we read, right? So the title, the Nazarene, was given to him by a demon. The demon that he cast out at the beginning of the Gospel of Mark. And the girl here is trying to confirm that Peter was with Jesus, the Nazarene, the Holy One of God. And in verse 68, he denied it. He denied it. The accusation is, you were with him. And he says, "No. I don't know what you're talking about." He says, I don't know and I don't understand what you're talking about. Clueless. Clueless. Verse 68. Peter lied and says he didn't know Jesus and left. He went to the porch. He didn't know what she was talking about. My mind got clouded there for a minute. I think the Nazarenes in the Old Testament made a covenant not to cut their hair. I'll probably have to study up on that, and I'll tell you about it the next sermon. I didn't read up on it, so I apologize for those of you that are scholars and know everything about the Nazarenes, but I kind of got clouded there for a minute. I apologize. So anyway, when you go to verse 69, it says here that the maid saw him, that is Peter, and began once more to say to the bystanders, this is one of them. That's one of the Nazarenes. That guy right there, he's one of those disciple people who follow that guy that's on trial in there. Yeah, that's one of them. I know that guy, because I've seen him running around with that Nazarene guy. It's amazing. It's when the accusation comes out, that's when everybody who was ever against Christ, that's when they all come out. Everybody's out there. Oh yeah, that was one of them. I've seen him. The butler, the baker and the candlestick maker. Everybody now wants to jump on the bandwagon and saying, yeah, I know that guy. So the maid identified Peter as a disciple of the Nazarene. He was one of them. And in verse 70, we have Peter's response. It says, but again he was denying it. And after a little while, the bystanders were again saying to Peter, surely you are one of them. Them, for you are a Galilean too. You see, they didn't even say that. You are one of his disciples. You are one of his apostles. You are one of his followers. You are one of the people he forgave of their sins. You are one of the people that he healed. You are one of the people who he embraced. No, they said that you're one of them. Them, which is with a negative connotation, as those people who followed after that guy. They didn't even try to defend Christ and say, oh, you are the one with the teacher, with the master. No, you're one of those people. So in the house of Caiaphas, Christ was a no-no. He was a reject, and he was not embraced. You're from Galilee too, aren't you? You're one of those Galilean people. You were at the sea, and we saw you, and we know you. We know what you've done with him and where you went. They have that version of Christ. And so what was in the leaders was also in the servants. And you can feel it. What was in the leaders was also in the whole household. So it wasn't just the Jews, the Jewish leaders, but it was also those who served them. And if those who served them, that means their families, their friends. So there was a group there that finally couldn't hold it in anymore, and they had to come out. And when they came out under the what? Authority of the devil, this is what happened. They finally confronted him. How many people want to confront me in Seattle and in Portland and want to remove me out of my own ministry? So in verse 71, we see Peter's response to this last time, right? Calling him a Galilean, calling him one of them, saying that he was a follower of the Nazarene. I mean, he couldn't defend it, because if he did, it would have come to bloodshed. So he just said, I don't know. I don't know this fellow you're talking about. He says, I'm sorry. I can't give you my real response. I don't know the man. I have no idea who he is. I don't know. What do you want me to tell you? Right? What do you want me to tell you? I don't know this fellow you're talking about. I'm sorry. And in our very last verse, Mark says, and immediately a cock crowed a second time. And Peter remembered how Jesus had made the remark to him, before a cock crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. And he began to weep. So Peter lied again, and this time he cursed and swore against the people, claiming that he didn't know Jesus. The cock crowed a second time to fulfill Jesus' words to Peter. Peter wept, remembering Jesus' words. So to summarize and conclude this portion of Scripture, 66 to 72, we see that the words of Christ will always come to pass, even if one must deny him. The word of Christ will always come to pass, even if a disciple or a leader of the church must deny him. So in this passage, just like Jesus told Peter, you have to deny me. But yet his word had to be fulfilled. Peter would have stood with him all the way. Peter would have, if it would have gone, he would have just, oh wow. But he would have gone toe to toe with the Sanhedrin and with the Roman Empire. But he couldn't, because it would have costed him his life to earn. So he swallowed his pride. Right? But on the side of that, it's the words of Christ that will fulfill. Just like Jesus said, you will deny me 3 times. And to some degree, I feel like it's more of a command. You must deny me. Right? You will deny me. No, you must. Because if you don't, what would happen? Their blood would be shed. Their blood would be shed. And there would be war between disciples of Christ, the followers of Christ, the angels of God. But right then and there, they could have done it right there. I mean, all hell could have broken out in the Garden of Gethsemane, and it's the angels of the Lord against the angels of the devil, the sinners versus the saints, the leaders of the church, the 11 or the 12. Once Judas would have been released, I'm sure his real spirit would have given it back because he broke down in remorse. And, I mean, wow, can you imagine the catastrophe that could have taken place in that garden? So he told them, you will scatter, and at a later time you will gather. We will meet again in Galilee. He assured them, we will meet again in Galilee. So in conclusion, we see that in this chapter, chapter 14, is the beginning of Jesus' final journey, right? With his disciples / apostles. They began as disciples and they ended as apostles. We see in chapter 14, the Jewish leaders' plot was to betray him. Assassination. We see Jesus is anointed for burial. Judas seeks to betray Jesus. Jesus sends disciples to find a room. Jesus discloses a disciple's motive to betray. We see Jesus establishing a new covenant. Jesus leads his disciples to Gethsemane to pray. In the middle of the chapter, we see Jesus foretelling the disciples that they would be falling away. And at Gethsemane, Jesus prays and seeks God's will. Jesus betrayed by Judas. Then he is arrested, and the disciples flee. We also noted that there was a young man who was a witness who fled for his life. We see that Jesus was condemned and abused, and then he prophesied of his second coming after admitting to being the Messiah. We see Peter weeping for denying Jesus 3 times. So all these things occurred in chapter 14 to fulfill the words of Isaiah the prophet. in Isaiah 53, 1 through 12. He was despised and forsaken. He was rejected of men. But it's not done yet. We got to go to the next chapter, which only has 47 verses, and the chapter after that, which only has 20 verses, where Jesus is actually taken and nailed to a cross. Right? Where he's actually taken and nailed to a Roman cross. Right? So with the name church comes the cross of Christ. But God has given us the armor of God, the message of repentance, right? The message of repentance, that all of our sins, from all of our sins, Romans, Revelations, that's the message, that's the armor. The Lord tells us to carry the cross daily as the church, right? The church all over the world, whether you're the Catholic Church or the Protestant Church, if you are his disciple, you're going to be tempted like Judas, and you're going to be silenced like Peter. And at a later time, he'll restore you when, you'll have to give your testimony to him and repent of your sin. But here we are in the 21st century, and even in this day and age, we are still called by God and by Christ to be on the alert, right? So, at this hour, God is calling all of us, all of you, who know this gospel message, to repent, believe and be baptized in his Spirit by faith, right? Those who want his salvation must take him at his word. Even you in this generation, right? Even you in the 21st century. He fulfilled the words of Isaiah and Zechariah. And Peter fulfilled his promise to deny him. So will you fulfill his word to enter hell if you reject him. If the promise that he made to Peter came to pass, so will the promise that he made through John. You want to know what that promise is? You know what he says in John chapter 3? In John chapter 3, right? He says this, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have eternal life. For God did not send the Son into the world to judge the world, but that the world should be saved through him. He who believes in him is not judged. He who does not believe has been judged already, because he has not believed in the name of the only begotten Son of God. And this is the judgment, that the light is come into the world, and men love the darkness rather than the light, for their deeds were evil. For everyone who does evil hates the light, and does not come to the light, lest his deeds should be exposed. But he who practices the truth comes to the light, that his deeds may be manifested as having wrought in God." But the important passage here is verse 18, right? Because he says, "He who does not believe has been judged already," right? So will you fulfill his word to enter hell if you reject him. But if you embrace him by faith, then he will embrace you and forgive you of your sins and make you an heir of the promise of God in his blood. Right? He will make you an heir of the promise of God in his blood. So today, those of you who want to respond to this call of salvation, the prayer that I would pray is, "Father, I beseech you to have mercy on these people." Now, if you want to be born again, all you need to say is, "Lord, forgive me of my sins. I repent. I believe that Jesus died for my sin. Bless me with your indwelling spirit. Lead me through your word. Establish me as your child in the faith. In Jesus' name, amen. Now I would say, Lord, grant these people their desired wish in accordance with your scriptures. And in closing, I'd like to say, Lord, our Father, there are many others scattered who are still in the world searching for the truth, searching for love, searching for guidance, peace, searching for assurance, direction, searching for meaning, some a pure heart, and freedom from satanic slavery. Father, draw these people to yourself through this gospel of reconciliation, and grant them eternal life in Christ. May you be with those who have been walking with you in this age. Strengthen their walk and use them to make disciples of the nations who belong to the devil and his angels. Amen. It's at this time that I usually call people who are scattered to join me as the church. For you who are scattered, let this ministry be an opportunity to demonstrate your faith to God and in God, and join me as a believer, right? I will by faith claim you as God's child, pray with you, take communion with you, baptize you, teach you, and disciple you if you are new to the faith. If you are new to the faith. For those who are seasoned and in need of only prayer and fellowship, this also I am willing to do. For you too, because you are my brothers and sisters in Christ. And the Lord's command to us is for us not to forsake the assembling of the brethren in our Lord's name. Amen. Well, we are done. And I did not know it was going to take us this much time. We still have 2 chapters to do. And instead of giving you 3 videos, I've given you 1. So you can take the 1 video and watch it in portions, in half-hour segments. Or you can watch it and do your own studies and then come back and listen to what I have to say. You may get more insight in your studying by cross-referencing, looking up words, and just listening to me in this 1 segment. There's a whole lot more that could be said. But I've watered it down to where it's just this much. And pray that God will be with you this coming week. And Lord willing, I will see you out there to give you the message number. What message is this? Let's see, what message is this? Message number 20. Message number 23 from Mark 15, 1 through 47. Jesus on trial, betrayed, scourged, crucified, and died. And so he finally kicks the bucket. And God be with you, church. Amen.